Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL 2025 offseason overview, grades, and analysis video. We're going to be going through everything this offseason. We've got one less team to cover than you normally would expect with the LPL. Rare Atom has, of course, been bought out of the league. We've moved from 17 teams down to 16, and so not quite as much to talk about, but still so much more to get through than the other videos that we've done. Speaking of those other videos, I'll quickly plug them up in the iCard. You can check out the LEC and the LCK versions of these videos up there. I really wanted to try to get this LPL one out as quickly as possible before Demacia Cup. I wasn't able to get it before the first day of Demacia Cup. Hopefully I'll be able to get it before the second day of Demacia Cup, and so I appreciate you guys' patience, but LTA fans, you're gonna have to wait until later on in the week. Unfortunately, you will be the last region we cover here, but wanted to make sure we got to the LPL as quickly as possible. Ground rules at the start very quickly. First and foremost, this is not a power rankings video. This is not me going in depth on every single team and telling you exactly what they could or should look like going into 2025. This is an off-season grades video. This is me talking about whether or not I think the organization is making good moves and moving in the right direction. Whether or not I think a team will be competitive is going to be mentioned here, but it's not going to be the primary resource used when talking about whether or not they're, doing a good job or a bad job. That's mostly going to be determined by whether or not I think they have some sort of upside or they're getting better from what they were last year. There can be teams that maybe would finish really well, in my opinion, in the LPL. I almost said the LCK, in the LPL this year, but maybe aren't moving in a great direction, made some very safe, kind of low upside signings. And then you have teams that maybe are going to struggle a bit year one, but I do think they at least gave themselves some players to kind of see whether or not they land, some darts to throw, if you will. So I'll kind of talk about those specifics, but without further ado, let's get right into it. Up on the screen now, the key, the legend, whatever you want to say, however you want to call it, the grading scale. As we go throughout this video, I'll quickly go over this. I always get a lot of comments, but if you're watching the LPL video, chances are you've watched at least some of the LEC or the LCK one. Whether or not you've agreed or disagreed with those takes is kind of up to you, but chances are you've at least seen this scale before, so I'll quickly fly through it. First and foremost, very flexible. This is not meant to be some sort of hard grading scale where a B+ is vastly different than a B or an A- or something like that. If you're 1 or 2 grades away from where I'm at, perhaps our scales are just different. I got some comments on the LCK video where it's like, you have every single player too low. It's like, okay, well, if I have every single player 1 grade lower than you do, perhaps my scale is just scaled down 1 lower than yours, right? Like, that's just how it ends up going. You don't necessarily have to have every single player in the A's if they're fantastic. I think that value can often be determined more so by, circumstance. But A is, generally speaking, when you talk about the key, kind of reserved for players that I think would be able to kind of be the best player on a world caliber team, regardless of who else is on the team. I don't think that there are 20 players in the world who kind of fit that description. I do think it's a rather elite club, and so that's what I've tried to keep it, and that's what you can see when it comes to kind of the descriptors. For A+ is just going to specify the player that I think is the best in the region. I never have given an A+ to multiple players in a region. It's just basically impossible. I think in terms of value, it's really, really difficult to justify giving someone an A+ grade that isn't like going to Worlds, winning MVP every single year, and has done it for the last 3 years. Even if you've been that elite player for a year or two, it's really hard for me to give an A+ to somebody who hasn't proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they could be a top 1 player in the world at any point in time. So that's what that's reserved for. A+ is only going to go to 1 player in this video. A is going to be a little bit more like open, I guess, but still not entirely open. These are your superstars. These are players that at any point in time could be playing as if they're the best player in the world, and likely at points in the year have been the best player in their role, if not like the best player in the role all year long. The best top laner, in my opinion, is in the LPL. The best AD carry, in my opinion, is in the LPL. They're going to get A grades, and players of that caliber are going to get A grades. If you're number 1 or number 2 in your role, but maybe aren't that A+, guaranteed superstar that will take a team to Worlds no matter what's around them, then you'll probably get an A grade. A- is still elite. I get so many comments every single video where it's like, you're disrespecting a player so much by putting them A- instead of A. I just can't fully comprehend how that makes any sense in my mind when every single video I go in depth at the start here talking about how A- is still like a top 1 or 2 player in your role in the world. Like, you are still a player that can win MVP in the best leagues in the world, that could win World Finals, that could be a contributing member, a World Finals MVP caliber player. Like, A- is still elite. This is a player that at any point in time could step up. The only difference for me between A+ or A and then A- is the consistency with which you do that. You know, A- players are at times going to give performances that are better than A+ players. If you're in the A's, that means I believe that at any point in time you could be the best player in your region. But again, it's just about the consistency that we've seen and, you know, how confident I am that you're guaranteed to get that over the course of an entire split. That's what A- means. But I see a lot of people saying that it's disrespectful to give a player an A- grade. That is certainly not how my grading scale works. You are looking at like the 5th or the 6th best player in the world having an A- grade. There are only 4 or 5 players in the world that I think have an A or above grade. Like, that's where A- lands. And so I hope that makes sense. I've definitely gotten a lot of comments about that, so I wanted to clarify it. As we get into the Bs, these are the good starters. These are players you feel really good about. B+ and B, there's basically no distinction in terms of upper tier talent level. It's more so just about how confident I feel that you're going to hit that, basically, no matter what. Like I said, consistency. B+ is a player that I feel very good is going to be a huge positive, is going to be a massive influence on their team in a good direction. Think of someone like Showmaker over in the LCK. You know, that's the kind of vibe I'm looking at, where you know he's going to be a positive. Maybe he hasn't been quite as good as, you know, the best players in the world at the top of the standings, players like Chovy, but he's still been a really, really good player, and any team would like to have him. That's what a B+ kind of classifies as. And B is going to have very similar upside. You're going to be looking at players that either have looked really, really good in small sample sizes in the past at a top level, or are players that I think are good and should be starting for world caliber teams, but maybe aren't like ridiculous, like break the game type of players. These are really quality starters that are going to be around top 5 or so in their role in the world, or at least are going to be in the argument, are going to be all pro caliber, but maybe aren't quite as good or as consistent as the B+ or A- players. Then once you start getting into B-, these are players that absolutely should have starting jobs in the LPL. These are players that I would have been frustrated if they didn't have a starting spot in the LPL, but maybe they're not quite as good, or not they don't have the upside, in my opinion, as Bs or B+, things like that. These are players that are really solid and will likely be some of the better players on like some of the middle to bottom tier teams. Again, you're not going to be super frustrated with a B- starter, but if you're trying to make worlds, especially from the LPL with so many teams, this is likely a position you're going to look to upgrade, you know, somewhere down the line. This is not an elite starter, it's just a fine starter. It's someone you're okay with, it's someone you feel fine with, but maybe not someone that you would like really, really want to push for if you are, again, trying to make the world championships. As you get into the Cs, these are where the questions really start to rise for me. C+ is like, okay, I can understand why, you know, an organization would want to take a punt and try to start you, but there are significant questions about your game. There are significant questions about whether or not you can be consistent in that role. You're going to find a lot of C+ in the LPL, just players that have looked really good for small samples of time and then really bad for other samples of time that I just need to see a lot more of. I need to see them develop before I'm just willing to anoint them as a player that, you know, deserves a starting spot in the LPL. Once you get below C+, that's really, really where the questions start to arise. A C-graded player is somebody that has played at the LPL level and just hasn't really shown much, like very much needs to prove that they deserve to be in the LPL at all, and I'm a little bit questioning kind of the thought process behind bringing them in and making them a starter, especially in an LPL that is contracted by one team now. And then we finally get our first C- grade in this video. There have been none in the LEC and in the LCK, but we do have a C- player, so I actually have to talk about it here. This is a player that has just proven beyond a shadow of a doubt so far that they are not a starting caliber player at a top level. And again, there's only one in the LPL, and I'll go into that circumstance when we get there. Longtime fans of the channel might already know who that is, but C- is a grade that I give out super sparingly because it's basically me saying I would be stunned if you turned into an even remotely neutral starter. Like, I just do not see it in you. I think that it's a bad decision for the organization to sign you, and I don't think that there is any upside there. Even with something like a C grade, I could theoretically see you turning into a C+ or a B- by the end of the year if things were to develop. Like, C-, it's very difficult for me to ever imagine that you're going to turn into anywhere close to like a B- caliber player throughout the entire year. So we'll get to that when we get to that, but that grading scale, I hope it makes sense. Again, for rookies, it's a little bit different, or for players that have never played in the LPL, it's a little bit different. It just goes from B to C. Spoiler alert, LDL tape is a lot harder to find than LCK Challengers League tape or EU Masters tape, right? It's much more difficult to try to get some, you know, actual comprehensive analysis because there's no stat tracking and because the VODs are just very, very trapped on Weibo. And so, you know, most of these players are going to get pretty similar grades because I've only seen 2 or 3 games of them, these rookies, and and you know, that's something that hopefully I'll have more tape of them as we get into the actual power rankings as we get closer to the season itself. But for now, as we talk about the offseason, a lot of them are going to be in that B-, C+, C range. I just don't really, you know, rookies are going to be a little bit different. They're going to be graded on a different scale, and I'm going to be talking more about their upside. This grading scale is mostly for players who have already played in the LPL. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that intro wasn't too obnoxiously long, but really, I do not want to take too much time because we have 16 teams to get through, and we've got a lot to talk about. So without further ado, let's get into our first team of the video. If you are, again, new to the format, if this is your first video of mine on this channel, what we're going to do is go from number 1 to number 16 in terms of how these teams finished in the summer split of last year, or at least in terms of championship points, and we'll talk about their off seasons along the way. It's just the easiest way to structure this video, and that means starting off with our defending LPL champions, our back-to-back LPL champions, and our world finalists coming out of the LPL, Bilibili Gaming. This team is excellent. They were excellent last year all throughout the year. They were easily the best team to come out of the LPL, and they didn't really change anything. This isn't going to be a long segment. I think they're going to be very happy with their offseason because you're not really looking at a different roster. Their one quote-unquote change isn't even really a change. It's the exact same lineup they were trotting out in summer of last year. They just made a change at the World Championships, and they're officially committing to that change here with their starting 5. It's looking like Bin in the top lane, Wei in the jungle, Knight in the mid lane, LGD AD carry, and On at support. If you want to know what's going on up on the screen, this is a good chance to explain it because BLG isn't going to take too much time. You can see their seeding or how they finished in the top right. In this case, Bilibili Gaming was the first seed going to Worlds last year, so they're listed as such. Next to every single player is going to be a grade. That's where I personally grade them on the grading scale that I just went over at the beginning of this video. You can see how that has changed from last year to this year on the actual graphic itself, with the 2024 roster on top and the 2025 roster on the bottom. You can see a couple of things in the middle. No change will, of course, indicate that the player is the exact same as what they were last year. There's no real reason to talk about any sort of adjustment in the offseason. A change is going to indicate that it's a neutral change. You're going from one player to another, and there's some sort of, you know, complex argument to be made as to whether or not it will be an upgrade or a downgrade. Oftentimes, this is either side grading in terms of the performance that I think you're going to get, or you could be going from a player that might be better right now to a younger, more unproven player that maybe has more upside. That would typically be considered kind of a change, and you know, I'll talk about all of those in depth as we go throughout the video. And then upgrade or downgrade, if it is listed there, is going to be pretty self-explanatory. Upgrade is just, I think you got better in that position. Downgrade means I think you just got worse in that position, and again, we'll talk about those as we get to it. But for BLG, again, it's going to be very simple. Bin, Knight, Elk, On, all returning. This is the core of the team from last year, and if they would have made any changes, I honestly would have been upset and disappointed. This team ran the LPL last year. There was really no reason for them to change things around. They went to Game 5 in the World Finals. Like, this is everything you could have wanted out of an LPL team, and I think they could theoretically be getting more consistent as they played together more. We saw them get better throughout the year. There were some concerning performances at Worlds that I think definitely changed some people's opinions, but for the most part, this team should be just as good as they were last year. Bin, in my opinion, is the best top laner in the world, and I think the one that's really going to surprise people, Elk, in my opinion, is the best AD carry in the world. He is my A-graded ADC. I had him as number 1 last year, and I think he was the best performing ADC. I'm sure some LCK fans are going to be frustrated by that down in the comments section, but I really don't know what else there is to prove. He was the highest performing AD carry throughout all year in terms of domestic performances. His LPL showings definitely showcase that, but even if you want to say, well, the LCK is harder than the LPL, and, you know, being better in the LPL is not quite as good as being very good in the LCK, even if you do want to make that argument, all of that fell away at Worlds, where he was the best AD carry at Worlds. Like, he was unbelievably good at that tournament, and while this is a domestic ranking, this is a grading scale based on domestic play, what he did was go on the biggest stage and prove that his domestic showcase was not a fluke, that he is actually the best ADC in the world at the current moment. He knocked Hanwha Life out of the tournament. I'm not going to say single-handedly, that's a bit disrespectful to the rest of this team, but you know, he was the best player on the Rift against the best team from the LCK, and that's a really, really good sign. So I feel good about Elk. I feel good about Bin. I don't really think I have to argue for Bin being the best top laner in the world. I think everybody just kind of agrees with that at this point. And then Knight is going to be the only player in this video that receives an A+ grade. This should not be surprising at all to anybody who's followed the channel. This is the most obvious thing you could possibly do. Everywhere this guy goes, he wins. Like, there is such a positive correlation between Knight and success in the LPL that, yeah, having him is the most valuable thing you you can have in the LPL, and the fact that BLG was able to retain him, regardless of whether or not all the offseason drama was real or not, is a really good thing. He is the best player in the LPL, certainly the most valuable, and he's going to make this team a Worlds Finals contender, basically no matter what, even if they didn't have a bunch of A's surrounding him. On is coming back here as an A-. He maybe didn't have as good of a year as he had in 2023, in my opinion, but he was still really good last year, and he has solidified himself as an A-graded player, even if it is an A- because of the inconsistencies. And then really the only change you're making is officially committing to Wei in the jungle. Of course, he played out the second half of the year in the LPL as their starting jungler, but coming in, he's supposedly supposed to offer more solidification, more stability than what Shun offers individually as a player. They put Shun in at Worlds because he is more of that high upside, high ceiling type of player that can take over games, but if they really want to rely on being able to get Bin and Knight and Elk and On into those fantastic positions, Wei could perhaps even be better in that role, and we saw a lot of that in the summer split. It's hard for me to say that he is going to be better because he was benched at Worlds for Shun, and now he's kind of taking that full role, but obviously this team likes the playstyle fit with Wei a little bit better, and I honestly can't say I disagree. It's going to be interesting to see no matter what, because Shun's going to be going to a different team that we'll talk about a bit later, but Bilibili's not changing much. This is still going to be the team that is the gigantic favorite to win the league over and over again, and you have to consider it a successful offseason when you're able to retain a World Finals team. Then moving on to our second place team from last year, and it's a team that a lot of people have some strong opinions about. It's Top Esports. I think that they had a pretty good offseason, all things considered. They would have loved to retain Mako in the support position. That looked like it was never going to happen. It looks like Invictus was just going to go all in, basically no matter what. We'll get to them way down the line because IG finished really poorly last year, but talking about Top Esports as it is now, I think this team is going to be nearly as dangerous as they were last year, and they're still a very complete team across the board. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like 369 in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Cream in the mid lane, Jackie Love at AD carry, and Crisp at support. You're retaining 3 members from last year. I wouldn't say they're the best players from the team last year. It's hard to say that because you're losing the MVP in terms of production and what I would consider to be the most valuable player on the team in Mako, and so it's a little bit difficult to say that your offseason was perfect, but I think you did the best that you could, considering that it didn't really look like you were ever going to get someone like Mako back, and it does seem like Tian chose to just go into a different direction. It looked like Top Esports was trying to get him back and just didn't end up getting him. Spoiler alert, I don't really think they downgraded. I don't think this was a negative for them, but we'll get into that when we get into that. Let's start with the players that actually are being retained here. I think the best player on this team left is still Jackie Love. He's also going to get an A grade. Again, LCK fans are going to be really upset that I'm giving Jackie Love a higher grade than Viper, but I'm sorry, Jackie Love has been better than Viper over the last 2 years, at least in my opinion. He has been. The consistency is not a problem anymore. Everybody talks about this feast or famine style that Jackie Love brings, and it's just not there on tape anymore. The last 2 or so years, he's just been the pinnacle of a top tier AD carry every single game in and game out, regardless of how well his team is playing. Now, is some of that because he got to play with the best support in the world last year? Maybe, but it's not like he was playing bad before that. He was still my MVP in the 2023 summer split, even though his team didn't make Worlds. That's how good I thought Jackie Love was. This guy has continued to be like the pinnacle of excellence, and for some reason, I think we just forget how good he is because, you know, he's surrounded by good players. Do not sleep on Jackie Love. This guy's a prodigy for a reason. The A grade is more than justified, and then 369 is going to get an A- grade. He's the other top laner that's going to be in the A's, in my opinion. He's had his inconsistencies. I'm certainly not going to say his summer split was perfect, and honestly, I think his Worlds performance wasn't particularly good either, which is why he gets knocked down to an A-, but he was the best top laner in the world in the spring split, and if he can find any semblance of consistency getting back with someone like Kanavi, which I think could be a big positive, then that could be something that really, you know, unlocks Top Esports in the same way that they were unlocked for a lot of spring. You're also bringing back Cream. This to me felt like a no-brainer. You invested into a young mid laner that had never really been given a huge opportunity, and all he did was step up. He was the most consistent mid laner in the LPL last year, maybe outside of Knight, maybe even including Knight, right? Knight had a couple of struggles at the beginning of summer split. Cream was just good all the way through, and he was everything this team could have possibly asked him to be, and then some. He came up as an assassin player, kind of in that Zeka mold, playing Akali, playing Yone, playing a lot of those more, you know, melee aggressive picks, but last year he basically exclusively played, you know, weak side and shove and roam and played for his jungle, and it really worked out. His style has expanded so much since coming over to Top Esports. You had to bring him back. Again, a B+ might even be a bit disrespectful for the performances he put out last year. I'm just not sold that he's going to be able to repeat that excellent performance. If he is, then yeah, he's going to jump up to an A by the end of the year, but B+ for now, I think in terms of what he showed last year is fair. And then you have the 2 new additions. Of course, losing Mako sucks. Bringing in Crisp is going to be a bit of a divisive decision because the community is very against Crisp. I've been been a huge Crisp defender on this channel over the past couple of years. I think he is way better than he gets credit for. I think a lot of people look at his bad games and just assume that that's all of his games, but honestly, his bad games very much are few and far between in comparison to his good games, especially domestically, which again is kind of what we're grading here. Is he Mako? No. This is going to be considered a downgrade, as you can see on your screen, because losing Mako in general is going to be considered a downgrade. It's just hard to stay relevant at that position, or to stay neutral at that position when you're losing, in my opinion, the best support in the world. But Crisp is very, very close. He is a top 5-ish support in the world, and especially domestically, I think he's going to be just fine. He is the single best, like, engage finder ever. Like, it's not even really all that close. The creativity with which he finds flank angles is unmatched at not only the LPL level, but like in League of Legends history. It's kind of what he's known for, and he still does that regularly. He is still creating advantages that other supports just would never be able to see. He's just going to find himself in some bad positions in the mid game every so often, and his international showings over the past couple of years have not exactly been perfect, even though he was awesome at Worlds this past year. I think he really was very, very good at that tournament. I think him and Jackie Love could be a very, very dangerous bot lane, arguably the best in the LPL if everything goes right, but he's not Mako, which is why this is a downgrade. And then I'm going to call it a change in the jungle. People are going to call this a downgrade. I have no idea why Kanavi was so, like, under-prioritized in the offseason, or at least reportedly under-prioritized. It felt like Tion was this big prize that everybody was looking for. Top Esports, Weibo Gaming, LNG, JD Gaming, all of these teams were looking at Tion and trying to get him and trying to be like this big, centerpiece for their team. Kanavi as a secondary option is ridiculous. I think there's an argument to be made that Kanavi is a better player than Tion even was a better player last year, but was just a bit hard stuck on a JDG team that was very much not well-rounded. Tion, of course, the reigning MVP, and it's difficult to be able to match that production. I think he deserved it, by the way, but Kanavi is a player that I think could come in and be everything that Tion was for this team and then some, because I think he's a better early game player. I think Tion's a bit more consistent in the back half of the game, but Kanavi is the best early game jungler of all time, maybe with the exception of Canyon. So you don't really feel concerned about bringing Kanavi in here, especially because he's played with 369 on the top side before, who is kind of the core member of this team in terms of the reputation. So, I love 369. I love Kanavi as a duo. Hopefully they can reunite and, bring back some of that magic that they showed on JD Gaming. Overall, I think hopefully you're getting the same out of Cream. I think perhaps Cream could even have a better split if Kanavi is more dangerous as a solo carry coming out of the jungle. I'm a huge fan of Jackie Love and Crisp. I don't think is a huge downgrade. This is still going to be a team that competes for top 2, maybe even top 1 again if everything goes, right, if Kanavi's like an MVP caliber player, which is realistic on this team. I like Top Esports. I think their offseason is better than they will get credit for. But then moving on to the number 3 team from last year, and if you wanted to see a team that downgraded and really had to try to find some replacements, it's this one. It's LNG Esports. Of course, third seed last year, kind of shockingly. A lot of people expected this team to finish worse after the regular season. I wasn't particularly surprised. I've always been a little bit higher on this team and on these players, but they definitely had to scramble a bit after a really rough offseason. I have no idea what happened with this team. They had an announced roster online, like it showed their roster on the official database website, and then eventually it was just gone. Like Tion, gone. Scout, gone. Pays, gone. And that looked like it was going to be the core of this team, and it ended up just completely falling through. Even Crisp is not here anymore, which would have been totally fine to come in at the support position. As it is, they have some interesting pieces that I kind of like a little bit more than maybe the rest. We'll talk about some of the positives, but for the most part, this went from a team that was pretty clearly like an upper tier Worlds caliber team, a team that could finish top 8 or top 4 if everything were to go right at the World Championships, to a team that I really just don't think is going to be in the Worlds conversation going into 2024, which is a downgrade. And so, or 2025, I should say. I got to get used to the number change, but let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Zika in the top lane, Weiwei in the jungle, Haichao in the mid lane, Photic at AD carry, and Zhuo at support. Of course, the 2 remaining members are the topside members here, Zika and Weiwei. These are fine players to keep, but they are by far the least influential that this team had last year. Weiwei honestly had a bad year for most of last year. A lot of criticism was levied his way, and I think this team did feel the loss of Tarzan a lot more than they expected to. I think Weiwei came in and had a very different style to what Tarzan offered. Weiwei is much more, I don't want to say selfish, because that feels very pointed. That feels like a negative term, but he is a little bit more resource heavy as a player than someone like Tarzan is, and so he came in, and I think Scout had to sacrifice a lot more than he felt comfortable with. This team actually started to get good the moment that Weiwei was like, screw it, I'm just going to play Sejuani and Maokai every game. I'm just going to play super low resource, play for Scout. That's when things started to get back online for LNG. Perhaps things are a bit different now that Scout is leaving this team. I don't exactly know how that's going to work out, but Weiwei has a lot to prove to me. I've never been the biggest fan of his as a player, even when he was in the World Finals on Weibo Gaming. I've always thought he was a bit overrated individually as a player, so we'll see if that ends up coming to fruition. He has a chance to potentially be the primary resource getter on this team throughout this year. We'll see what ends up happening from that, but kind of on the opposite side of that, the alternative side of that is Zika in the top lane, who I've been kind of a defender of. I think he's actually been really good for this team considering the role that he's been given. He's mostly just been tasked with being a weak side top laner that is supposed to survive for this team as they give resources to players like Scout and Gala on the bottom side of the map, and he's been really good in that role, but he can carry if given resources. We saw that in the regular season last year. We've seen it basically throughout his entire career. I really like keeping him around. I just feel like you're losing a lot elsewhere, and that's going to start with the bot lane for me, or really it's going to, kind of encapsulate with the bot lane, because I actually am okay with the mid lane change. We'll get into that in a second, but Photic and Zhuo are just not it. I mean, if you followed the channel, if you're a longtime viewer, you know, like, Photic has been, like, the opposite of a channel darling for me. He's been receiving hype for his entire career, and I've constantly been pushing back on that hype, just saying, like, we gotta chill out. Like, this guy's not really all that good. Even when he was on Victory 5 back in the day with Rookie and with PP God, it really felt like he was being enabled to be this, like, stat machine where this team was setting him up to have the easiest job in the entire world, and he was still underperforming in big games. And then you take away that safety net. You look at his 2023, his first year without a lot of those star players. He was the worst player in the LPL in 2023, or he was in conversation for being the worst player in the LPL. Certainly one of the most detrimental on that NIP team, that first Ninjas in Pyjamas team. Last year, he definitely started to play better. He actually played really well in the spring split. I would say that, that was the best split of his entire career pretty handily for me, but he went right back to being Photic in summer, and it was really disappointing to see. For now, B- feels generous in terms of the grade that I'm giving him. This is obviously a downgrade from Gala, but I don't even think Photic is giving you half of what Gala gave you. I really do think this is a massive downgrade. I think Zhuo was fine. Like, individually, he's going to get criticized a lot more than Photic will because he's a support, and his plays look a lot worse. I think Photic is way worse than Zhuo, even if I am giving them similar grades. He did also start to regress, but he was awesome in spring as well, and I think he's been okay in the past. I don't think his tape is nearly as bad as people will make it out to be, considering his track record in terms of, like, records and, like, winning percentage. I don't think he is nearly as good as Hong. Obviously, this is a downgrade. Like, going from Hong to Zhuo is not ideal for LNG, but, you could survive if Zhuo was your support. I just think Photic and Zhuo as a bot lane is so low upside and, like, so not interesting to me, and I think they're going to struggle here, especially replacing one of the better bot lanes in the league. And then you are going from Scout to Haichao, and I have to call this a downgrade because you're losing Scout, who is one of the best mid laners of all time and has been one of the best mid laners over the past couple of years. But Haichao's actually a really good player. If you didn't watch any LGD last year, I don't blame you. That team was weird. They won for no reason, basically because of Haichao, and, were completely abused in the upper group in Group Ascend. And, I can forgive you for thinking that that team was just kind of a flash in the pan and that a lot of those players weren't exactly all that talented. But Haichao is actually a really, really good mid laner and, showed that off a lot last year. I did not believe in him before 2024. In fact, I was ready to pull the plug. I think I had him ranked as the number 17 mid laner going into last year because he hadn't shown anything at the LPL level, but he completely broke out. Now you're kind of looking at a player that's like borderline top 5, top 6 in terms of mid laners in the LPL in terms of performances, and that's a really good thing for LNG to add. Theoretically, he gives you the upside that you could potentially have another, upper tier. Like, you could have signed the cream of this offseason, right? Where last offseason, Top Esports brings in Cream, he adds a little bit of stability, he adds to his game, he ends up becoming one of the better mids in the LPL. You could have done that here with Haichao. I think that that's very realistic. The problem is, I don't think you have the surrounding core that, someone like Cream had last year. I don't think Photic and Zhuo are going to be winning all that much in the bot lane 2v2. I don't think Weiwei is going to be giving him a ton of resources in the mid lane, and Zeke is not exactly the, like, strongest side player in the universe. And so, as much as I like Haichao, I don't know if this is the same kind of situation that can allow him to break out. But if LNG is going to overperform my expectations, it's probably going to be because of the mid lane here, because of Haichao. So I like Zika. I think, like, Haichao is good. I think solo lanes could be solid, but this is not the same, like, world's definitive team that they were last year. This is not a team that's going to be looking to make top 8 or top 4. They're going to be happy to, be near the top 4 of the LPL. And so we'll see how it ends up going, but definitely got to be considered a downgrade in terms of offseason. Then moving on to our final Worlds team from last year, and a team that continuously overperforms at the World Championships, it's Weibo Gaming. And their offseason's much more positive than their, other Worlds counterpart that they beat in LNG that we just talked about. They kind of had a neutral offseason. I think they had started with a pretty good team, and they end with a pretty good team. I think you could argue they got better. I think a lot of people will argue they got better. I think they kind of side graded in most roles, which is fine. I think a lot of other teams in the LPL got worse, and so let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Breathe in the top lane, Tian in the jungle, Xiaohu in the mid lane, Light at AD carry, and Hong at support. I don't think it's crazy for me to say that this is a little bit more of a side grade in terms of how things are going. You're obviously staying the same in a couple of key areas, but unfortunately you're staying the same in a lot of roles that were already a little bit more contentious, maybe outside of AD carry. Light coming back was the most obvious decision in the universe. I continue to think that he's not elite. There are going to be some people that argue that he is, but I've always been the biggest Light defender, and I think he's like firmly established himself as the B+ AD carry in the LPL. He's not quite as good as like the top 3 or the top 4 or whatever you want to consider the upper echelon, but he is definitely better than everyone else. Like, he is somebody that you can make World Finals with. You can make World Finals because of Light. If he's playing really well, he's just hyper consistent. He's always going to be in the right space at the right time. He's not really going to make any major mistakes. He doesn't have the same kind of mechanical upside that you're going to get out of the best players in the world, out of Elk or Jackie Love that we've already talked about, but you might get more consistency out of Light than you are going to get out of those players. If you wanted him at an A-, that's totally fine. I think that that's entirely fair. For me, he comes in as the pinnacle of like the B+ grade, a really, really good player that any top team would really like to have, but is likely going to be better as a secondary option on the best team in the world than he is as a primary option. The other 2 players that you're bringing back, though, definitely a little bit more concerning for me. Breathe, I'm fine with. There just aren't a lot of top laners that you're going to get a ton of consistency out of, but Breathe had a ton of bad moments in summer. Still really like him as a player, and I think projecting forward, he's probably going to be fine, but I would be remiss to not mention that he wasn't exactly perfect in the summer split, which is why he gets a B grade and not a B+ grade, because the inconsistency is definitely there. And if you want to talk about inconsistent, Xiaohu is the pinnacle of inconsistency right now. This guy has just become the most feast or famine player in the entire universe. There were long stretches in 2024 where he was like the worst mid laner in the LPL, not just like the worst of the top mid laners, but actually like the worst mid laner in the LPL. Hopefully that's not going to be a problem moving forward. If it is, ruh-roh, but you're bringing him back. Hopefully he can be stable. I think you're introducing an even more unstable jungle into this equation in terms of Tian, and so hopefully that ends up working out. I am a bit concerned for Xiaohu just in terms of his, performances that we've seen recently, but he is still going to be a little bit better, on the upside than some of the other players, and so he is going to stay in the B range, especially because of the track record that he has for being one of the best mid laners of all time. It's really hard for me to put him lower than B, but if he has another bad split, he's going to fall into that B- C+ range a lot faster than I think a lot of other people are going to be willing to give him, because that's what he was last year. He was much closer to a B- or a C+ in the mid lane, with really the exception of the end of the LPL season and really at Worlds. Like, that's kind of the only time he actually played up to this B ranking throughout last year, but it's a pretty good time to do so, so I guess we'll see. But the 2 new additions, you have Tian coming in here to the jungle. I talked about it a bit earlier. Tian kind of the prize of the offseason, maybe outside of Scout and Pays to an extent. Tian is a really good player. I mean, he's a multiple-time MVP at the LPL level. He's somebody who's been a part of some pretty successful teams. He's a World Finals MVP, which a lot of people tend to forget that this guy's not only a world champion, but like was the Finals MVP at Worlds in 2019. And so, he's obviously a player that deserves an A grade. He is more than earned that. I think that there have been some times on this channel that I've talked about him in a lower light, most notably 2022, when it really felt like he was getting overhyped and really Knight was doing a lot of the heavy lifting on that top esports team, and he kind of got exposed for that at Worlds, but I think he's really shored up his game since then, and I think the thing with Tian is he's so greedy, right? He's such a complete player in the sense that when he's playing well, like his playstyle is to make sure that the enemy jungle or the enemy team doesn't have any resource to even try and take. He wants Rift Herald, he wants Grubs, he wants Dragons, he doesn't want to like seed an objective. He wants to fight for everything on the map, and that can be a really, really positive thing when you're the better team. We've seen it be a bit of a negative when the team is losing, and honestly, we saw at Worlds him just kind of shut down in some pretty pivotal moments. That's something I'm considering, but this is, of course, a domestic ranking, and as a domestic player, he can be nothing less than an A-, which to me is a neutral change from how good Tarzan was, their best player clearly last year. And then I think you're also getting closer to a neutral change in the support position. This is like a slight upgrade, in my opinion. I think Hong just offers more consistency, but Crisp is still a really good player, and again, he was awesome last year, much better than he will get credit for. Again, I think Hong is more consistent. You're not going to get the bad plays with Hong that you get with Crisp, but you're probably not going to get like the ridiculous creative engage angles that you get with Crisp, and the reason I really liked this bot lane for a long time is Light is mega stable, which allows Crisp to be this big playmaker and know that if he's in the right position and if he sets up his AD carry well, that Light will basically always follow through. What you're getting here is a much more stable bot lane with Light and Hong, but maybe it doesn't have the same kind of explosive potential in the mid game that Light and Crisp kind of showed off a lot last year. I think this is going to be fine. Again, I like Hong more. He's going to come in like half a grade higher, half a tier higher. They're both B pluses, but Hong is like a B plus plus, if you will. He was kind of on the verge of an A minus B plus. He's one of the best supports in the LPL and in the world, but you know, I think it's pretty obvious where I stand on Weibo. I think their playstyle maybe will change a little bit. Maybe you are getting a little bit more aggressive coming out of the jungle spot, but you were already such a jungle-focused team last year with Tarzan being like your MVP caliber player that you wanted to play through at the end of the year. I don't think anything is going to change with that. I think Tion might even take more of a role in that respect, and maybe you're getting more consistent in the bot lane. This should still be a team that competes to make the World Championships and to be a threat at the World Championships. They might just do it in a slightly different way. But then moving on now to our non-Worlds teams as we've gotten through the top 4, and it's the team that came oh so close. It's JD Gaming. Of course, pretty shockingly not making Worlds last year. I think a lot of people just expected this team to be a Worlds team, including me. Like, Kanavi and Ruler missing Worlds was genuinely insane in terms of the history that we've seen from League. But talk about the winners of the offseason from the LPL, in my opinion. I think you went from a team that had pretty clear like problems and pretty clear holes in terms of their lineup to a team that's much more well-rounded and basically strong in every position, which I don't think you could say for all of last year. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Ale in the top lane, Shun in the jungle, Scout in the mid lane, Pays at AD carry, and Missing at support. No returning player outside of Missing in the support position. This is fine to bring back. I think Missing had maybe his worst year as a pro last year. He was really bad for sections of last year, actively losing games for JD Gaming. And I think even when you go back to some of the pre-JDG, days, the WE days, he was still a lot better, I think, for the WE teams than he was for JDG in 2024. You have to imagine that it was just circumstance, right? That there was a lot going wrong with this team, that the solo lanes were just kind of disastrous for a majority of the year for this team, and they couldn't really find any sort of consistency, and Missing was just taking too many risks in that regard, but his laning got significantly worse, and that was always the thing I thought he was the best at as a player. I always thought he was a terrific laner, and he still is a terrific laner, but we have to see that kind of turn itself back around. Losing Ruler is a loss for this team, and we'll talk about that. I do think they did about as good as they possibly could have to get a replacement here in, Pays, basically getting that swap with Gen G, but Missing coming back has something to prove for me. He is not this player where it's like, oh, he was the one, shining light for JDG when they were struggling last year. No, he was a part of the struggles for JDG, and he was part of the reason this team ended up missing the World Championships last year. So he has something to show me, but everything else I think is just a huge W. I think you were arguably getting better everywhere, maybe with the exception of like jungle and bot lane. I think those are the only roles where, at least here, I have the grades getting lower, but it's so marginal in terms of what you're expecting there. And honestly, can you say that like Shun had a worse year than Kanavi last year? I don't think I necessarily can say that. Can you say that Pays had a worse year than Ruler from a performance perspective? Absolutely not. Pays was LCK MVP in my opinion, and Ruler didn't make Worlds. I think you're looking at players that are at least in the ballpark, even if I do have them going down in terms of their grades and numbers. We'll start with Pays because he's the most interesting conversation to have in my opinion. I think him getting that swap over from Gen G, I listed it as a change in the LCK video. I have to list it as a change here. I do think that you're getting worse in terms of talent, if only because I really believe in Ruler. Like, he's the best AD carry of all time. I've talked about that a lot on this channel. I feel pretty strongly about that opinion, but Pays is a generational type of talent, and Gen G saw that. They brought him through the system as a replacement to Ruler, and honestly, he's done everything he's been asked to do. Maybe there's been a bit of inconsistency. People are going to point out some of the games in the spring split where he was not getting a ton of resources. He wasn't necessarily playing strong side and was struggling a bit, but the moment they started giving him like even the smallest amount of resources, he immediately became an MVP caliber player again in the LCK. I think he could be an absolute star here in the LPL where, bot lanes are even more ferocious, where they're getting even more resources, where typically teams are even more willing to invest into their AD carries. I think Pays could be an absolute monster in terms of production. Hopefully him and Missing have good chemistry, but I'm listing this as a change, even if it is like a slight downgrade. I would rather have Ruler than Pays, if only because of the consistency, but Pays as like a secondary option, very similar to what I said about Kanavi earlier, is like, I mean, that's a dream secondary option for a lot of teams. And he was kind of coupled and packaged with Scout throughout a lot of this offseason, or at least that's how it seemed. Wherever, one of these guys would go, the other would also follow. It felt kind of like they were a duo in free agency. It felt like they were going to LNG and they back out of that deal. They end up going here to JD Gaming, but whoever ended up landing the Scout Pays sweepstakes obviously won here. This is an upgrade in the mid lane. Scout is just better than Yagao. Yagao had a pretty miserable year last year in comparison to his standards. I've been a big Yagao defender over the course of his career because I do think that he gets a little bit undervalued for how important he was towards some of the more successful LPL teams of the era. I think specifically back on the 2022 version of JD Gaming, and then even in 2023 on Bilibili, I thought he was a lot more important than he got credit for. Obviously struggled down the stretch, is probably the reason this team did not make Worlds last year, and a lot of people are going to look at that. He's retired now. I wish him the best in retirement, but Scout is an upgrade. Scout is the second best mid laner in the LPL, only behind Knight, and he has proven that over and over again. The moment that he gets resources, the moment he starts to feel unlocked as a player. My only concern with Scout and Pays as a duo is that perhaps they could be a little bit too resource heavy, like both of them, right? Scout worked really well with someone like Gala on LNG, or even someone like Viper back on Edward Gaming, because both of them can operate so well in these low resource environments, because Scout is such a high resource player coming out of the mid lane. He's somebody who likes to be played for. He likes to be the primary option on the teams that he's on. Now, Pays has never really shown that he can be a brilliant weak side player, but he has the talent in him to do that. If they can do that together as a duo, especially because they wanted to work together, obviously Scout as an addition is brilliant here. He's a huge upgrade over Yagao from a mechanical perspective. The other concern I have is bringing Shun in. This is the only other way I could see this being a little bit problematic for JD Gaming, is that one of Scout's biggest problems last year was playing with Weiwei, playing with this really aggressive, resource-heavy, more carry-oriented jungler. That's kind of Shun. Now, I do think Shun is better than Weiwei. I think he's certainly more talented, and I do think he's more versatile. I think he can play Maokai and Sejuani at a higher level than someone like, Weiwei could for LNG last year. The problem is you don't really bring in Shun, especially for as high of a price tag as reported him being brought in for, if you're not letting him play a lot of his aggressive picks, things like the Nidalee and the Kindred and, these more carry-oriented picks. It's going to be interesting to see how that jungle mid ends up working out, but from a value perspective, this is awesome. Shun continues to be undervalued because, Bilibili had such ridiculously high expectations, but this is a guy who's been to an MSI finals, who's been to a world finals, who has, absolutely dominated domestically and has been pretty good internationally as well, was very good at Worlds this past year. This is a fantastic addition if you are going to lose someone like Kanavi. I perhaps would have tried to bring back Kanavi, but I'm not sure about the import tag stuff. Kanavi, Scout, and Pays, I think are all, technically still taking up an import slot, at least as far as I'm aware of, and so maybe Scout or Kanavi are, regionalized by this point, but I don't know. So if that was a problem, then getting Shun as a domestic jungler is about as good as you could possibly do. You can absolutely win Worlds with Shun as your jungler. The only concern is the fit. And then you're bringing in Ale in the top lane. In my opinion, easily the most underrated top laner in the world. He is like top 5 pretty clearly, in my opinion. He's going to come in as a B+, and spoiler alert, that's a top 3 grade in the LPL. He's only behind the top 2, the big ones, Bin and 369. I think Ale is right up there with anybody else in the LPL in terms of the skill that he offers. He was great for AL last year. He was even okay on EDG when everything was going wrong. When they did win games, it was often through him, and it was clear he just mentally checked out when that team was really bad in the spring split, so I'm willing to kind of give him a pass in that regard, but this is an upgrade over whatever they had in the top lane last year, whether it was Flandre, who I've listed here, or Sheer, both of which we will talk about later, because both of them still have starting jobs in the LPL, so you'll see their grades later. Ale is better than both of them, and he's certainly going to give you a better output, in my opinion, than what you got from that role before. But again, really the only concern with this team is that there are too many mouths to feed, that there are too many cooks in the kitchen. Ale is a strong side player. Shun likes resources. Scout likes resources. Pays likes resources. And so I could see that being an issue. I think that is something from a team cohesion perspective that I could see being a problem, but from a value perspective and from an off-season analysis perspective, it's pretty clear to me that of all the LPL teams, JDG probably had the best offseason. But then moving on to the final team that made the regional qualifiers last year, and we're kind of out of the teams that I think are Worlds contenders. I think everybody else is just kind of fighting to stay relevant in the LPL. And that does include this team, which is, of course, Ninjas in Pyjamas. You could argue that getting 6th last year was kind of an overperformance for this team, but in the preseason, they were supposed to be up there. I mean, this is a team that was coming off of some pretty interesting offseason moves. You're bringing Rookie back, and you're surrounding him with some good topside players from OMG that have worked really well together in the past. Photic and Juo, while I thought were pretty bad and, definitely was a lot lower on, people had high expectations for them. Them getting 6th isn't the worst thing in the entire world, but it was a rocky road, we'll just say, to get there, a rough road to end up getting to 6th place, and I think they felt pretty lucky to get there with their results. They definitely made some changes this offseason. They kind of had to, in terms of the way that this team is structured, with the way other organizations ended up taking some of their talent. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Shanji in the top lane, Aki in the jungle, Neni in the mid lane, Leave at AD carry, and PP God at support. This is a weird team in terms of construction, because honestly, this is a really high upside team. Their floor is in absolute hell. Like, genuinely, any game that this team plays could be an absolute disaster for them, but the upside is there. The mechanical talent on this team is actually really good, and I think that there is a world in which this team kind of ends up being, like, competitive. Maybe not, like, top 5 or top 6 competitive, as I said. I think top 5 or 6 is just so separated from everybody else in the LPL in terms of talent that I just have a hard time imagining that, but this could be a top, 8 or 9 team if everything were to go right, and I think that's a decent offseason. You're kind of retaining 2 people here. Shanji, obviously, coming back in the top lane. Boy, what a year Shanji had. Talk about ups and downs. He was really bad, I would say, for most of last year, just really disappointing. He was very clearly like the number 3 top laner in the LPL for me going into 2024. Nowhere close to that coming into 2025. He truly was horrendous. Now, he was pretty good in the playoffs when this team really needed him the most, and that does give me some confidence to keep him around the B-, but he was nowhere even close to being a B- player for a majority of last year. The talent is there. We know the talent is there. He's just got to be able to stay consistent. And if he can't do that with Rookie on the team, that's a bit of a concern. You are kind of bringing Aki back as well. Leon obviously took over that jungle spot in the playoffs, and kind of moving forward, Aki got benched because he just wasn't what this team was looking for. They needed a lot more firepower coming out of the jungle, and Leon definitely gave them that. I think these two are relatively similar in terms of the value that they offer the team. I think Leon is just much more of a carry-oriented player. Aki, very much a Maokai Sejuani player. He's very much a facilitator. I've really liked Aki in the past. His 2023 was phenomenal. I think it's like truly underrated how good his 2023 was, but he deserved to get benched last year. And so, we'll see what ends up happening with him and whether or not he can get back some of that form. But we've seen what Shanji and Aki can do together when they are in good form and when they are playing with PP God in the support position. The first player I want to talk about here, he's the upgrade here on this offseason. He is better than Juo. I would rather have PP God than Juo, just purely off of track record, even if he wasn't particularly great last year. I think there were some good moments. The OMG bot lane was surprisingly good in summer when Starry came in, and we'll talk about that a bit more once we get to OMG a bit later. But, PP God, I think, is somebody that the moment he jumps around to a new team, his first split or his first year on a new team almost always goes incredibly well for him. You have to hope that that's going to be the case here. I have him graded as such. B is pretty respectable, I would say, considering some of the play that we got from him last year, but I imagine he's going to come in and actually be a positive for this team, and I think that's a really big part of kind of the puzzle here because, Shanji and Aki without PP God definitely looked a lot worse when they didn't have him as the primary shot caller, and you're bringing in one of the most volatile AD carry players in the entire region in Leave. Now, Leave, we know, has the talent to be a top-tier player at the LPL level because his rookie split, his spring of 2023 was phenomenal, like genuinely unbelievably good. As a replacement to Viper on Edward Gaming, he certainly had a lot to live up to, and he absolutely lived up to it. Like, he was excellent. That rookie split ends up falling into controversy in summer and getting benched for a lot of different reasons, but comes back in 2024, and the consistency is completely gone. I've never seen a player quite like Leave before. I know a lot of you don't watch like my weekly reviews on the LPL every single week, so I'll quickly summarize what I said about Leave every single game, which is, oh my god, this guy's so talented, he's so good at getting leads, he's putting himself in really good positions, and then he makes one mistake at 20-ish minutes into the game that is like actually game losing, and like loses the game for his entire team. Like, it's inevitable. He had this complete lapse in judgment at least once per game where he is in such a bad spot that it instantly takes his entire lead and throws it away. And that was his big problem last year. The problem is not mechanics. The problem is decision making. If you pair him up with someone like PP God, perhaps you can get him to lock in. Perhaps you can get him to stabilize a little bit down in the bot lane, and this could be better than a C+ grade, but I just can't go higher than a C+ grade. He lost so many games single-handedly for a bad team last year that it's really hard for me to say that he's going to be an upgrade to someone like Fodic, even though I do think he has higher potential than someone like Fodic. I think bringing him in and especially pairing him with PP God could be a really good thing. I don't think it's like a bad punt at all, but you know, I gotta see it, man, because holy crap, last year was just so frustrating to watch. And kind of on the flip side of that, you are bringing Nenny in to be your starting mid laner here. There was rumors that it was gonna be Cryan for a lot of this offseason. I don't think this really matters all that much. Cryan perhaps gives you a higher floor, and this is a downgrade because you're going from Rookie, who's one of the best mid laners in the world, to Nenny, and obviously that's gonna be a downgrade, but honestly, I don't hate Nenny's tape. I know a lot of people are going to look at this and be like, Nenny's really bad, and, you know, this is definitely not a great addition. His tape was a lot better than I think he got credit for, and even going back and rewatching some of Invictus last year, he was the stable presence on that team. He wasn't really winning super hard, but the thing about Nenny is that he rarely ever loses lane. Like, even against the best mid laners in the region, he's really good at staying even. He's really good at staying competitive, and he doesn't really make any major mistakes. I think pairing that up with someone like Aki could be a really stable mid-jungle duo, but the concern is that perhaps it lacks a bit of explosiveness, right? That's something we're going to have to see, but if it opens up more avenues for players like Shanji and especially Leave to get more resources, I could see Nenny actually being a pretty valuable player for this team. Obviously, again, it's still a downgrade, even if I do like Nenny at least a little bit, because you're going from Rookie to Nenny, and that's just not a good trade-off, but I don't think this is a bad signing by any means. I think he could come in and be a really stable mid laner. I don't think he has the upside to ever be like a genuinely great mid laner. Like we talked about Hai Chao getting brought into a team earlier. He's never going to be that kind of prospect, like a Cream kind of prospect where he goes from a bad team or a mediocre team to a good team and, you know, kind of unlocks himself. I just don't see the mechanical ceiling on him, but the floor I think is a lot higher than people think it is, and I think he'll be fine for this team, which does open up the door for the more volatile players to get more resources. So we'll end up seeing how NIP play. I think they have an interesting offseason. They certainly took some punts on some players. I think Leave and PP God could be a very good duo, and I don't hate the signing of Nenny, but again, we're kind of taking a step down in terms of tiers from this point. But then moving on now to our first of the teams that made the playoffs but didn't quite make the regional qualifiers, and spoiler alert, this is one of the last teams we're going to talk about that I think is actually a Worlds contender in this video. It's Anyone's Legend, and I'm not sure if everybody's going to be on board with that take, or if everyone's going to be a little like, okay, well, they're good, but they're maybe not that good, but is this just like a better version of what Weibo Gaming was last year, with Tarzan kind of at the helm of a group of players that are good, but maybe aren't great? You're getting a better mid laner, a worse bot laner, and probably around the same level in the top lane. And so you just kind of, you look at a team like that and you go, it could be dangerous if everything were to go right, but I guess we'll talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Flandre in the top lane, Tarzan in the jungle, Shanks in the mid lane, Hope at AD carry, and Kale at support. There is so much good. There's so much good to talk about with this offseason. I continue to be a big fan of this organization's decisions. I know it's not necessarily paid off for me every time over the past couple of years. I've put a lot of faith into their offseasons because generally I think this org has made good decisions and tried to be relevant while not like breaking the bank in a lot of instances. I think this is another, you know, circumstance where if this was a top 4 team next year, I'm not going to be stunned, and I think that's a really good place for AL to be, even if they're probably not projected to be there. Of course, you're bringing back Shanks, Hope, and Kale. I think Shanks is kind of the core member of this team at this point. He's the player that they're likely going to be building around. I would love to give him a B+. I would love for him to be higher in my grading scale, because for large stretches of last year, he was like a B+, A- type of performer. He was carrying this team when they were, you know, destroying Group D and really kind of proving themselves as a top 4 team in the region. And then, like clockwork, the same thing that's happened to Shanks every single season happened once again, and he completely fell off in the last month. I genuinely don't know why this happens every single year, but it just feels like there's nothing that can be done about it at this point. Shanks is the kind of player that you're going to get a phenomenal, you know, 2/3 of the year from, and then the last 1/3 of the year is just going to be a lot worse. And for that, he's going to get a B because he's inconsistent. If he finally figures it out and has a full year where he's an MVP caliber player like he was for like large stretches of both spring and summer of last year, then you're going to love that. It just hasn't been there. The consistency needs to get better, and he was a big reason why this team ended up not being competitive and not making the regional qualifiers last year. So again, I love Shanks, and I love the upside. He is an incredible player, and he's likely the best player that they could have kept on this team, but I need to see that consistency improve. And then bringing back Hope and Kale, I think this is fine. They are such a stable, you know, high floor, low ceiling kind of bot lane. Kale is really good as a support. He's somebody that I think has a much higher ceiling in terms of, you know, what you could potentially get out of him. I don't think it's really wrong to kind of compare him to someone like Missing that could potentially break through in a situation like this, but, you know, I've been talking about him for years. I was a big fan of his on Sandbox back in the day when he was playing with Prince. I thought that bot lane was mega underrated, and he was very good for this team last year, but Hope continues to be Hope. Like, he is the exact player that I've been saying he has been for many years. You know what you're getting out of him, which is a player who's fine in most areas of the game, is going to get abused by the best players in the region. He's not going to be on the same level as like the top 4 AD carries. He's not really going to be able to go toe-to-toe with them, but he's going to be more than fine at beating up the lower tier players. I think he is one of the bigger concerns for me as a team that's trying to make Worlds, is going to be whether or not Hope can kind of lock in and be that positive presence in those situations that he needs to be. I think he can be. You know, he's been to World semifinals before. He knows how to be on winning teams. I just think his role is so much bigger on this team than it was on those, and there are going to be games that he just loses in terms of the laning matchup. You know, it just is what it is. I don't think he's a superstar by any means, but you could have worse in the AD carry role. But the two new additions I think are very, very intriguing because they're both big veterans. They're both like long-time successful players at this level. We'll start with Tarzan because this is obviously the gigantic pickup. This is an upgrade from Krako. You know, I think Krako's fine, very inconsistent. You have to take the good with the bad when it comes with Krako, but Tarzan is the type of player that I think genuinely could make like a game-breaking impact on AL. This is the kind of player that you bring in and he could potentially be the missing piece that gets you into that top 4. He's getting an A- for a reason. This is a player that I would consider to be easily a top 5 jungler in the world, as he was last year. I think he proved that me having so much faith in him going into the year was very justified, and me being so critical of LNG just kind of moving on from him was like, that aged well. You know, a lot of my Tarzan takes have aged well. I've defended players like him and Peanut for a long time on this channel because they're not the flashiest in the world, although Tarzan was pretty flashy last year. Typically speaking, they're not the flashiest in the world as more tank-oriented players, but they are going to get the job done, and they are going to be very relevant. And I think bringing him in, especially with someone like Shanks in the mid lane, that could be a terrifying mid-jungle duo. I really like the chemistry between their play styles. Hopefully that's there in terms of their communication and their synergy as people and as players, but from like a playstyle perspective, I can understand why AL looked at the ability to bring in Tarzan and said, like, this is our missing piece. This is what gets us over the top. I think that that's actually a pretty realistic thing to believe, and so we'll see how that ends up going. And then Flandre is going to come in as just kind of a stabilizing presence on the top side. I was not a huge fan of Flandre last year. I thought generally he was pretty bad. I'm going to give him a B. I feel like that's relatively fair. This is a player that obviously has done very well in the past. He's been a world champion, you know, before. He can succeed at this level. I think he's a little bit past like the prime era of what we expect from Flandre. He's not that 1v1 god on the top side that he used to be. He's not this team fighting monster that he used to be, but we saw flashes specifically in the spring playoffs. There were some really good games. I think outside of that though, you know, Sheer was the better of the two JD Gaming top laners last year in my opinion, and Flandre kind of undeservedly got a lot of the spots in some pivotal moments for JD Gaming, and I think honestly it came back to bite them. Flandre in those games was not particularly good, and so you're kind of hoping you can get kind of a turnaround now that Flandre is a full-time starter and presumably going to be practicing full-time with the first team. But really, when you're looking at AL, it's the Tarzan bring that really makes me excited about this offseason. And unlike what we just talked about with Ninjas and Pyjamas, this is to me clearly one of the big 6, as I've been saying. I think there are 6 teams in the LPL that are really good. This is the 5th one that we've talked about in this video. I'm sure you can guess who the final 6th one is, but AL very much deserves to be considered more so in the upper echelon than a lot of the teams they finished around in 2024. But then moving on now to number 8 from last year, and it's one of the feel-good teams, I think, in terms of overperformances in 2024. It's FunPlus Phoenix, and of course they had to make some changes. There were a lot of things that really felt out of their control. I think generally they actually did fine in terms of a lot of the changes they made. They've upgraded in some pretty key areas, in my opinion, and gotten some pretty nice upside, but there was only so much they could do. They were going to lose their Korean bot lane. They were going to lose their star jungler. They just kind of had to deal with that. Again, I think they did an okay job. I think this team will be competitive, and a couple of the youngsters I really like, but there are some concerns with this team, so let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Sheer in the top lane, Sorrow in the jungle, Care in the mid lane, Bat at AD carry, and Jway at support. Some positives and some negatives from this offseason. Again, like I said, Milky Way, Dectum, and Life were the 3 main players that got FPX over that hump last season that kind of got them into the playoffs and made them relevant. Milky Way in particular was the captain, the leader, the star of this team, but he was on loan from RNG. He always was going to be going back to RNG at the start of this year, or at least that was the report. And so they had to do their best. They end up promoting Sorrow from their FPX Blaze team. We'll get to that in a second, but the players that are remaining here, or the player that is remaining here, is going to be Care in the mid lane. He very much is the long tenured FPX member at this point, which feels kind of crazy. I don't really know how to evaluate Care, because going into last year, I was actually really high on him. I had him at a B grade. I was like, this could be one of the players that ends up breaking out and, kind of jumping up to that B plus range, kind of similar to what I talked about with that cluster of like Cream last year and like Hai Chao this year. Felt like Care was on the same trajectory where he could potentially be one of those mid laners that really becomes a star, and it did not happen. He had the worst year of his career, in my opinion. I thought he was actively detrimental to FPX for a majority of the year. He was constantly losing lane, constantly putting his team in bad positions in the mid game, and just wasn't consistent really at all. Now, that was a bit different in the playoffs where he played the best games of his entire year, but Care generally took a pretty major step back for me, and that's why he's down to a B-. This is kind of averaging out his 2023 and 2024 grades for me, kind of closer to a C+ last year, maybe a C in terms of the performances he gave, but we've seen what it can look like for him to look like a breakout star in the past, and so for now, he's going to be a B-, somebody that, should have a spot in the LPL based on previous tape, but definitely has to earn a higher grade going into this year. I'm fine with you bringing him back, but him being the only returning member from this overperforming team is definitely a bit disappointing, considering I thought he was the weak link last year in terms of his individual showcases, but a lot of other things to talk about here. You've got the promotions, you've got some players coming over that played in the LPL last year. The big one for me is Sheer in the top lane. This is a really good addition, and I don't know if it's going to be kind of considered as such. Sheer showed so much promise on JD Gaming, and obviously it wasn't consistent. He had some really bad games. There's a reason he's coming in as a B-graded player, but this is also a guy who went up against Top Esports, was actively put into the top lane for one of his first games ever at the pro level against Top Esports, and like dominated 369 in the 1v1. That was a game that opened my eyes to see, oh, Sheer can be like an actual game-breaking threat. This kid's 18 years old, allegedly. He looks like he's 14, and so, I understand a lot of the skepticism, but whatever the case, the kid's super young. He's obviously not very experienced in terms of pro communication and being able to play on stage. JD Gaming was his first ever professional team, like let alone like top-level LPL experience, and so this kid still has so much to learn, but the potential and the promise is definitely there. The mechanics are definitely there. I love this addition. It's only considered a change because I think there is a realistic world in which getting him out of the JD Gaming system and into a more unproven kind of team around him is bad for him and ends up, making him look like a rookie, unlike what he kind of was for parts of last year, but the talent is there, and this is a huge get for FPX. Like, he could potentially turn into a star top laner for them if things were to go right. You're also bringing in Jue in the support position. This is going to be more of a direct downgrade for me. I actually think Jue was fine last year. He was surprisingly good. Not surprisingly. I had a really high grade on him coming out of the LDL, and I think that I was expecting him to be solid, and he kind of lived up to expectations. He did not exceed them. He did not underperform them. There were some pluses, some minuses, some good games and some bad games. He ends up swapping teams mid-year because Ultra Prime wants to go get Nickit instead of Jue. He ends up going to Rare Atom and being fine on a Rare Atom team that probably should have done better, but life was incredibly good for this team last year. He was actually a much bigger part of why this team was winning than he gets credit for. He was easily, I would say, as relevant as Milky Way for parts of last year, if not more relevant during certain sections. Obviously, the consistency wasn't there, but this is going to be a downgrade. I don't think Jue showed on tape anything that would lead me to believe he'll have the impact that Life had for this team last year, and that's fine. I think this is fine. Like, Jue is a perfectly reasonable addition in a circumstance like this. But then you get the two promotions. Sorrow is going to be the internal one. Also have to kind of list this as a downgrade, even though I don't hate Sorrow's tape, just because Milky Way was so important and so relevant to this team's success. Basically going from him to anybody else that's unproven is going to be a downgrade. He was an MVP caliber player for parts of last year. Now, the inconsistencies very much arose. There was a reason this team kind of had a ceiling on them, and that's because they played through Milky Way. When he won, they looked really good, and he was in good spots, and, the team was able to kind of function. When he would lose, like, they would be unplayable. Like, there was no way for this team to win the game outside of Milky Way winning it. You could argue that that's on the rest of the team, but I would argue that Milky Way's style kind of lends itself to that. It reminds me a lot of Bo when I would analyze him over in the LEC. Sorrow is not that kind of player, but again, very similar to kind of what I've talked about, or what I will talk about with a lot of the LDL players. I'm still getting to tape on a lot of them. I've watched 2 or 3 games of every player that I'm going to talk about in today's videos, but I don't have any stats to kind of back any of my assertions up. It's such a small sample size. I'm going to try to refrain from being super in-depth on on them, but Saro looks fine. This is an organization and specifically a position that has done really well coming out of FPX Blaze. FunPlus has always done a really good job of developing junglers, and Saro's just kind of hopefully the next in line for that. So I guess we'll end up seeing, whether he ends up being a fine replacement. For now, I'm going to give him a C+ grade. Didn't see anything on tape that would indicate that he's going to be sensational year one, but again, it was only 2 or 3 games. Bat is a player I have much more familiarity with. He is still going to come in as a C+, but not only did I get to watch him in the finals last year on Max in the LDL, which was obviously kind of a much grander experience, and we got to see more of him in terms of their playoff run, but I've actually reviewed his tape a lot in the past, looking at Zhao Huangren tape when he was on Thunder Talk's Youth Academy. And so Bat is a player I'm much more familiar with. I think he's a pretty decent AD carry. I don't think he's like a star prospect. I think coming in here, he should have a pretty high floor. I don't imagine the ceiling is ridiculously high on him. Perhaps I'm just underestimating what his mechanics are. I've done that with some AD carries in the past, LPL-wise, because everybody in this region is just cracked mechanically. But Bat is one of those players that I would expect to come in and be fine, to be average. I'm considering this a change from Dectum, who I think can have his pluses and minuses. He actually came in as a B- grade because of some of those inconsistencies. I think Bat could basically give you what Dectum was giving this team last year, which is stability at the AD carry role. Dectum had some really good games for this team. Maybe I'm underrating him a bit by giving him a B-, but Bat I think could be basically what he was. I just think the surrounding core is much more unproven. Care really needs to bounce back or else this team is going to struggle. And, I like the idea of moving in the youth direction, but some of these players have to land, right? I think Bat and Jue could be a strength as a bot lane. I think that that's very reasonable. And if Sheer is also a strength in the top lane, that's a really good thing. And I think taking punts on players like Sheer and Jue after what they showed at the LPL level last year is a good idea. It's just a pretty unproven strategy, and they're going to have another kind of surprisingly good year if things are going to go right for them. And then moving on to the other kind of feel-good team from last year. We're getting them all out of the way now, don't worry. It's LGD Gaming, the team that shocked everybody by making Group Ascend and, being one of the top 2 teams in their group and not necessarily performing well in Group Ascend, but still kind of existing in Group Ascend, which is more than you can say for every team after this. So congrats to them for that. They unfortunately have to go in a pretty different direction. They have to get rid of a lot of their established players, mostly because their star from last year in Haichao goes over to LNG, a bigger offer, bigger team with more opportunities. But they are investing into the youth. Literally, they are investing into their youth team, LGD Youth, obviously doing super well in the LDL last year, winning the entire tournament. What do? They say, screw it, we're just going to promote everybody from that team, and we're just going to see what happens. Now, it's not quite as simple as that. This is much closer to being like a promotion of Team China from the Esports International Tournament from last year, which obviously they also ended up winning, but there is reason to believe that this team could come in and be relevant. Now, I'm generally a little bit cautious about like full rookie teams or teams that are pretty inexperienced, because we've seen in the past that typically players develop the best when they're surrounded by veterans, and they can kind of be the one that is making mistakes and taking a lot of the resources and being more of like the new player, and you have people around them that can stabilize even if they are making those mistakes. Typically speaking, full rookie teams don't do super well in the East, but we'll see if this ends up being the exception, because I do think this is a group of players that is relatively talented in their own right. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Saci in the top lane, Climber in the jungle, XQW in the mid lane, Xiaoya at AD carry, and YCX at support. Now, if I say any of those names wrong, let me know down in the comment section below. Saci or, XQW or YCX, if it's, something else, let me know. I can only obviously find the VODs of LDL in Chinese. And so I can't, I don't know how these players are pronounced. I'm watching most of these games on mute. If I mispronounce somebody, especially one of the players that is coming up from the LDL, just let me know down in the comments and I'll be sure to change that for upcoming videos. But kind of talking about what I've seen on tape. First of all, Xiaoya is the player that I guess is quote unquote coming back. He didn't even play most of the year for LGD. He was kind of the second AD carry that they went to after, Kepler wasn't particularly good for this team. Who could have seen that coming? Oh, wait. I told everybody that Kepler was horrible in last year's version of this video, but Xiaoya came in and did fine, I guess. He was pretty bad, I would say, for this team overall, especially once he got to Group Ascend. He was just getting abused left and right, and it really did not look particularly good, but I'm willing to give him a little bit of grace because he was really thrust into a pretty bad situation for him as a young player, and now he's getting to play with a group of players that I think are, more comfortable with him. He's played with Climber and XQW before in terms of, how these players have stacked up, and so you have to imagine that this is going to be a better situation, a better environment for him to be able to take advantage of. For that, I'm giving him a C+, because I do think there were small flashes last split where I could see some of the upside and the potential, and I talked about that in the videos, but it was very, very small flashes. Like, there were not a lot of really good moments from Xiaoya. This C+ grade is mostly based off of me kind of treating him as a rookie coming into this year and kind of giving him a second shot to show me something at the LPL level. But everybody else here, no experience at the LPL level. The one player that I actually feel really good about coming out of the LDL tape is going to be Climber coming out of the jungle. To me, he was very clearly the best player in the LDL. At least that's kind of what I've seen so far watching the playoff tape and specifically watching the finals against Max. He was incredibly good in that series, and I've heard a lot of good things from other people about him as well. I think Climber is the player that I'm expecting the most of in terms of, rookie success of the players getting promoted. The problem is, surrounding him with other rookies could theoretically lead to him just taking on too much of a responsibility in year one, not necessarily being able to live up to that. We'll see how that ends up going for him, but he is the only rookie, spoiler alert, to get anything higher than a C+ grade coming into the year. I think he's deserved like a B- value grade because I do think he is a very good player, and this is not a downgrade from Meteor. I think Meteor was already a player that I was questioning the versatility of. He's a very one-dimensional player. He likes to play his AD carries. He likes to play Graves and Kindred and things like that, and he looks significantly worse on other champions. I think Climber is much more versatile as a player and could be an upgrade in year one, even though people really like Meteor. I think Climber is that good, so we'll see how that ends up going. He is, again, the one player that I feel the best about, I would say. XQW, the other player that I think you feel at least really solid about, maybe not great. He's like the high end of C+ for me. He's a solid mid laner, and I think if you are going to move on from Haichao, I think XQW has good enough tape where I feel pretty decent about him stepping into the role. Still a lot to prove, at least in my opinion, and Haichao was really good and was the star of this team. That's why this is listed as a downgrade, because you're going from a really good player in Haichao that had a lot of upside that you kind of probably wanted to build around to a player in XQW that's kind of just a worse version of him, but, it kind of seemed out of your control. It felt like Haichao was just always going to leave for a bigger team this offseason, and LNG was the one to end up scooping him up. But XQW, I think, is a fine replacement, still coming in as a C+, because I just don't trust that he's quite the prospect that Climber is. But, I think this mid-jungle could be really good as it was in the LDL if everything were to click well. Saci and YCX are definitely a little bit less proven for me. Saci is another player that I've actually seen quite a bit of because he was on those Thunder Talk teams with Xiao Huanggren, with Bat, that we talked about earlier. He was an interesting evaluation for me because I think that there are so many good and bad parts of his game. I'm shocked that they went with him over Nuo, who is apparently still in the system, still going to be playing for their LDL team. I had a better score on Nuo than I did on Saci, but clearly they see something in him mechanically that I don't, or at least haven't in my limited tape review of him, so I guess we'll see with that. And then YCX, a player that was in the EDG system for a little while, was the backup to Vampire on Edward Gaming for most of last year. That should kind of show you where he was at. He's fine. He's a player that, developed some chemistry with this team through that Esports World Cup or that Esports International tournament representing Team China, and eventually kind of got brought over. We'll see how he ends up faring. He is definitely the player I have the least amount of film knowledge on because it's just so hard to find top tier footage of like Edward Gaming youth from last year in the LDL, at least in any like easily accessible quantification because it's not on Leopedia. So overall, we'll see. This is the youth experiment for LGD once again. I think there are good pieces here. Climber in particular is somebody that I feel really good about, but I think the bot lane is really going to struggle. I could see top lane being kind of a hit or miss role, especially going from someone like Bertle, who already was pretty hit or miss. I don't know if you have the same kind of mechanical upside with someone like Saci as you did with Bertle, who would give you good games every once in a while. I like the mid-jungle duo, but they're going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting early on, at least in terms of my evaluations right now. So for LGD, I would be surprised if they were able to replicate this top 10 finish going into 2025, but, I'm never going to criticize an org too heavily for investing into their own young talent. But then moving on to our first team to come out of Group Nirvana, at least in this video. It's a team with very few changes. It's Thunder Talk Gaming, and some could consider that a positive, the fact that they are running back a lot of the team from last year. I'm going to consider this a negative because you're running back most of the team from last year except your best player, the one that absolutely carried you in a lot of key instances, and you just got worse in that position. You end up making a trade, I believe, with DRX to be able to go and get their young mid laner that did not work out last year, sending UCal back to the LCK, and now you're hoping to replicate that success, but without like the one guy who kind of got you there. I don't think this is going to be a very good Thunder Talk Gaming team. I don't think they're going to be nearly as competitive as they've been in the past couple of years, and I don't think this is a very good offseason for them. It's one of the worst, in my opinion, in the LPL and probably in the East with how highly I view a lot of the LCK offseason. So let's get into it. Their lineup is looking like Hoya in the top lane, Beishwan in the jungle, Satab in the mid lane, 1xN at AD carry, and Feather at support. This is just such a strange decision. I think some of these players coming back feel fine. Like 1xN coming back felt obvious. This feels like the young upside move. You know, he's the player that you've kind of been developing down in the AD carry role. And while I'm not nearly as high on a lot of these superstar, next future mega star AD carries that every LPL fan likes to claim, I think he's fine. He comes in as a B- for me. He is a solid player. He's in that cluster of a lot of B-esque AD carries that have really high upside players like, you know, Starry and Assume. You know, we'll talk Leave, I think, is kind of in that category as well. We'll talk more about a lot of those players as we continue to move on, but, you know, 1xN's in that cluster of players that I think are fine, or, you know, definitely like solid starting caliber AD carries, but have not proven to me that they deserve to be on like upper tier teams just yet, in my opinion. You know, Feather, I think, had decent chemistry with him, so bringing him back, I think, is fine. I'm a little bit lower on Feather. I actually see people hyping him up a little bit. Generally speaking, I thought he was just kind of fine. I think he was not particularly good at the beginning of last year. I think he got better and more comfortable as he played more for Thunder Talk, and I think he was fine down the stretch, but certainly not someone that's like blowing me away in terms of his skill set. He's a C+ for a reason. Like, I think they could have done better in the support position, but if him and 1xN felt good playing together, if you want to run that back, I think that's fine. I really liked Feather in the LDL many years ago, and so, you know, I still think there's upside for him as a player. And then you're bringing back the veterans on the top side. We'll start with Beishwan, because I will continue to defend him. Like, he gets so much shit from the community. He gets, like, absolutely torched on Reddit in the same way that, like, if you're an AD carry in the LPL, they're going to coddle you and hold your head and, like, tell you everything's okay. If you're a jungler in the LPL, they're gonna, like, stab you with pitchforks, blame you for every single loss. Like, Beishwan has definitely received a lot of the negative criticism. Now, in spring, it was entirely justified. He was one of the worst players in the LPL in the spring split, actively losing this team games very regularly, but he had a really good summer split. He was very good in particular in Group Nirvana. I thought he was one of the best junglers there, and he continues to kind of be the epitome of like a C+ caliber jungler for me. I think he's going to give you super inconsistently okay results. Like, in good moments, he's going to look fine. He is a facilitating type of jungler. He's not the kind of guy who's going to go out and dominate on Nidalee. Like, he can do that. His mechanics are okay, but he's on this team for his shot calling and for his like macro ability, and that's just what he's going to offer. He's going to get out mechanicked, out skilled in a lot of instances, and when he's going up against really good junglers, he's going to look horrible. But when he's going up against players that don't have as good of a sense of the map as he does, he can do a really good job of taking away resources. I think it's fine to bring him back. You know, I wouldn't maybe have done it. I would probably have looked for other options because I just don't think he's like a super high upside player. But, you know, I've been a Beishwan defender. I'm going to continue to say that he's at the very least playable at this level. I can't say as much for Hoya. This guy's just not been very good for Thunder Talk. He was pretty okay that first split he ended up coming over. I want to say it was summer of 22. It could have been like spring of 2023. It was sometime around there where he came over mid-year and, you know, started in the top lane, and he actually was pretty good in that first iteration for Thunder Talk. Ever since then, it's just been an absolute disaster for him. He's getting run over in 1v1s. He's not really able to do anything in team fights because he's always so far behind in gold. Like, I just don't think he's a good player. I think that you can do 1,000 times better with almost any other LDL punt. You had Saucy yourself that you could have potentially promoted and started here and, you know, forced LGD to play like Nuo or something. Nuo is on LGD Youth. Maybe they're not willing to part with him, but like, there are other top laners that felt like they could have been the option here. And, you know, for Hoya to be taking up an import slot first and foremost, and also being like easily the worst player on this team, I'm just concerned about that decision making and bringing him back, you know, piling that on to bringing back Beishwan, who's already such a low upside player, and Feather, who I'm not like super sold by. 1xN I don't think is a superstar, and he's looking like he's going to be the best player. He's going to have to be the best player on this team moving into next year. It just doesn't feel great. All of those flaws were kind of hidden because UCal has been so good, like an all-pro caliber player for Thunder Talk, but that's not going to get hidden with Satab coming in here. He's going to get a downgrade. He's going to get a C grade coming into this split. He was awful for DRX, and while I do think his LCK Challengers League tape is much better if you go back to like 2023. If I'm just going off of what I saw in 2024, this is a huge downgrade because this guy was horrible, so bad that he was getting benched from one of the worst teams in the LCK. It's just not something I feel particularly good about. It reminds me a lot of when LGD ended up bringing in Envy a couple of years ago, and we'll talk about WE over the course of this offseason. Boy, howdy, am I excited to get to the WE section, but Satab reminds me a lot of those moves in that, like, you're gambling on a buy low where you're just hoping to get the upside of a player who has not even remotely been able to show it at a top level. I just don't really like this decision making. I think this is going to be a pretty weak team, and I don't like this offseason. I don't really like running it back for Thunder Talk in this instance. I think changes kind of needed to be made for this org, and they didn't really make any. They don't really have a ridiculous amount of upside outside of like 1xN, obviously, and then potentially like Feather, and then maybe Satab, like if everything were to go right, but you don't really ever see this team being a top 8 team in any circumstance. And the top side of the map is like super low ceiling, and so I really don't understand their low floor, low ceiling. I think this is going to be one of the weaker teams in the league. They don't really feel like they have any sort of direction. This is a bad offseason, and I'm going to grade it as so. Then moving on to our 11th team, we're finally beyond the 10 that we've normally done for these videos. We're going to jump into, oh my god, OMG. And this is a really interesting offseason. I think there are some good punts here. I think generally there is good development coming out of their system. I just don't think this team excites me really in any way. I think they could have theoretical upside. I just don't think that there's like ever a world in which this becomes a top 6 or top 7 team unless, someone like Starry ends up breaking through, and I think that just kind of hampers some of the excitement for me when it comes to this team. But overall, I think their offseason is fine. I certainly would have done a couple of things differently, and I don't think they got better. In fact, as you can probably see from these grades, I do think they got worse, but they're all listed as changes because I could see a world in which this is the right thing to do, to just move forward and to try to get some youth in the building to see like what sticks, but I'm just not in love with any of these players in particular. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Harry in the top lane, Hang in the jungle, Lin Fang in the mid lane, Starry at AD carry, and Moham at support. Of course, two and a half remaining members from OMG last year. Starry is the big one. He should be kind of the core that this team is building around. This is one of my, I would say, worst takes from last year, where I just didn't see it in Starry's LDL tape. I was really kind of pushing back on a lot of the hype, especially OMG, like as an organization. They felt like they were really investing a lot into him because they got rid of Abel for him, and that felt like a very strange decision. It felt like Abel was progressing nicely. He was a player they brought in because of the upside many, many years ago, and it felt like he was finally starting to become a bit of the core of the team. Him and PP God had good chemistry, even if they weren't perfect in the spring split, and they end up making the decision to go with Starry after kind of giving that a trial run at the start of spring anyways, and I was like, I just don't like this decision. I think sticking with Abel, especially with, kind of the format that the LPL had last year, like they had a real shot of being a team that tried to compete to get into Group Ascent. It just felt like the wrong decision to go to Starry, but that ended up turning out really wrong. Like, he was really, really good for them in summer. Easily the best player, just in terms of performances, I would say, on this team in summer. I mean, Tianjin definitely had a nice bounce back. Angel is a player I really like, and he got his shit together by the end of the split. But Starry was kind of a big, selling point for OMG, and so obviously you run it back with him. I really have no complaints. He is in that cluster, as I talked about before, with 1xN and Assume, and again, even Leave to like a smaller extent where these are really hyped LPL ADCs that are going to get overhyped because LPL ADCs generally get overhyped, and they're all fine players, but I don't think any of them are ever going to become like top 4, top 5 players. Starry is probably the one that I think has the highest ceiling out of all of those players, just in terms of the mechanics. What he showed in the LPL last split was genuinely spectacular. I think he has shown the most, arguably, of anybody on that list, maybe outside of Assume at his absolute best, but Starry's mechanics are better. So, we'll see what ends up happening with him. I think it's obviously the right choice to run him back. He's a player that I'm very much going to be watching in 2025 to see his development. The other player they're bringing back, I am much more critical of, and that's going to be Harry in the top lane. This is just a player that has received so much hype and so much praise, and this talk of like so much potential, and I've just never seen it in him and in his game. I've never really understood why people are so high on him. Even back on the Ultra Prime days, like it just never really felt like he was who he was being talked up to be. His laning stats were good, but his team fighting was atrocious, and he was losing games for his team. He was pretty inconsistent. He goes over to AL with that big, like, not super team, but, like, actually relevant team, and it takes him getting replaced by All-A mid-year for them to be relevant under any circumstance. He ends up coming over here to OMG and getting the top lane spot only because Cube was just genuinely so unplayable for them throughout a majority of last year that they had to go in another direction. He was the only one available mid-season, and now they're bringing him back, like, I'm not a fan of Harry. He's going to come in, spoiler alert, ranked as the worst top laner in the league. Maybe outside of Hoya. I mean, they're going to be fighting it out for it going into the year. I just don't really have a lot of faith in Harry, and I think it's a mistake to bring him back, which is why I say there's some good and some bad with this offseason. Obviously, building around Starry is the right thing to do, and bringing in a support that now has Worlds experience and obviously can play, engagers really well, set up his AD carry really well, I think is a good idea. But bringing Harry back, I think, is much more, confusing and concerning to me. The other half a player, I guess, that you're bringing back is Lin Fang here in the mid lane. Obviously, he's been a part of this OMG system for a little while, but he actually played in the LPL quite a bit last year as a replacement for Angel when it just felt like they were throwing everything at the wall and seeing what stuck. Obviously, Starry stuck. You end up signing Harry and Tianjin mid-season to try to figure something out, but Lin Fang is going to be the direction they're moving in going forward. He was fine in the LPL, but obviously he probably wasn't practicing with the first team all that much with Angel on the roster, and I imagine he's going to have a lot more time to actually showcase his abilities over the course of this split. Hopefully he's going to be fine. Right now I have this listed as a change. I originally had this listed as a downgrade, but changed it right before filming this. It doesn't necessarily feel fair to kind of list this as a downgrade when you could theoretically be getting what you got out of Angel with Lin Fang for cheaper if he is to develop. I think the mechanics are there. I think he's a fine player, and I think this is an okay decision if you trust your internal evaluation process. But, losing Angel I think is definitely going to be a bit of a hit. He's a pretty good player, and so we'll see what Lin Fang offers. But again, I'm not frustrated by promoting him and giving him the full-time mid lane spot. I think that's generally good practice, and he's surrounded by players that have experience at this level, which is a good thing. But I already talked about him a bit. Moham coming in to play support. They're importing him from D+ Kia and from the LCK. He was given that spot halfway through last summer split, replacing Kellen, and generally the team got worse after he was put in. I was very surprised to see him kind of get that role moving forward with the Worlds team for D+ Kia, but that doesn't mean I dislike Moham individually as a player. His grade is slightly impacted here by the fact that he's an import. I haven't really brought that up too much because, honestly, in the LPL it matters less. You're typically not running into import problems, like import slot problems. You typically don't feel like you need to go over the two import rule with how much Chinese talent there actually is, like domestic LPL talent there actually is. But, Moham is going to get impacted at least a little bit because I think there are other options that were available that are around his skill level. So he goes from probably being about a B graded player, somewhere around the same skill level as PP God, to being a little bit worse as a B- in terms of value, but he's just very one-dimensional in terms of his playstyle. He gets a lot of shit for being a rel one trick, and unfortunately a lot of that is kind of rightfully so. He is very much an engage one trick. It's not just rel, he is a rel Alistair Leona player. Like, that is just what he's going to do. Theoretically, that should be good to set up, Starry or Lin Fang to be able to take over some of these mid and late games. You kind of want somebody that can be proactive in the support position, especially losing someone like PP God. His replacement coming in needs to be somebody that can actually take over the game, but he's not going to be versatile. I don't think he's ever going to be a top support. I think he could be a good support at this level, a B caliber player, somebody who's on a top 7 or 8 team in the LPL and contributes to that team, kind of similar to what Life was last year as an import. But I kind of need to see it with this group of players because, enabling Starry is really kind of the main goal for OMG, and if he's not able to do that, that's definitely going to be something, and his macro has been a weakness, basically every stop that he's been on. So, big shoes to fill with PP God going out, but, I think he has the talent to be able to step in. Hang is the other kind of new addition here coming into the jungle. He's replacing Tianjin. If you would have asked me whether or not this would be an upgrade or a downgrade at the start of summer last year, I would have said this was a huge upgrade. Hang was coming off of a spring split, but a pretty decent 2023, and his tape generally looked pretty good. He's super aggressive as a jungler, somebody who's very active in the early game, and I was super out on Tianjin. I was ready to call him the worst player in the LPL because for a lot of spring he kind of was. He was overplayed for the talent level he was at the time, but Tianjin comes in midway through last year for OMG and honestly plays awesome. He genuinely played really well in Group Nirvana. Now, again, the talent pool of that, circumstance was a lot lower, and so I'm not just going to sit here and give him a B or a B- grade because he was really horrible when he was playing more talent before that. But, this isn't quite as cut and dry of a plus or a minus as I think some people are going to make it out to be. I think Hang in summer of last split was worse than Tianjin, but I think Hang's track record is significantly better than Tianjin's, and so I think coming in here, I think this is a fine punt. Again, Hang is a very aggressive player. I think that could pair up really nicely with someone like Moham. They could control the early and mid game really well, and especially if you are able to snowball that out of control, if Lin Fang and Starry actually do step up and are good carries for this team, I could see them being halfway decent, like a top 9 or top 10 team in terms of the results. I think the process of getting there is maybe a little flawed because I really don't like, bringing Harry back. There are other options in the top lane that I think you could have, gone out and got. you're buying low on players like Hang, and you're even buying kind of mid on someone like Moham, who was completely left out of all the LCK rosters, and you just kind of picked him up because he was available. Like, it's not exactly the highest priority team in the world, and OMG was on such a good trajectory just like 2 years ago that it feels a bit frustrating to see them here right now, but I think in terms of the circumstance, there were worse off seasons in the LPL. But now it's finally time to get to the team that everybody has been waiting for. I don't know why I didn't restructure the entire video to get these guys earlier. They're in the thumbnail, for crying out loud. It's Invictus Gaming, the winners of the offseason, period. Across basically every single league in the entire world, there was no team that got as much better as IG did over the course of the last few months. They have gone from a team that is middling towards the bottom of the standings, that is overperforming entirely by getting 12th in the LPL, to a team that should be favorites to make Worlds this upcoming year. They are the final team that we'll talk about that is genuinely good, basically across the board, although they do have their own issues, and we'll talk about that as we go through it, but it's 5 upgrades. It's upgrades across the board. You, again, went from a team that, was struggling to even try and be relevant in Group Nirvana to a team that could be one of the best in the entire world. It's incredible stuff, but we'll go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like the Shy in the top lane, Jeje in the jungle, Rookie in the mid lane, Gala at AD carry, and Mako at support. Obviously, you're bringing the IG solo laners back, the IG boys, the Shy and Rookie, back onto this team, both coming off of some interesting years, I would say overall. Rookie was phenomenal on Ninjas and Pyjamas for most of the year, definitely struggled a bit down the stretch, but I think most of that was just the sheer amount of lifting that he had to do for that team to get them across the finish line. He was the only one attempting to win games for them for most of the year, and so bringing him back in is obviously great. It's Rookie, he's one of the best players of all time. Being able to bring him back to the org that he is most well known for is a dream, and obviously that's an upgrade, but bringing the Shy along with him is going to bring back a lot of nostalgic memories for Invictus Gaming fans, although I do have to remind them, this hasn't exactly been like a super successful duo outside of 2018. They were so good in 2018, and they were great at the start of 2019, but after that, things really started to go a bit sour for Invictus Gaming. It wasn't quite the easy path that a lot of people remember. These two really struggled to be able to find chemistry. I think once the Shy started to develop as like a pure star, like an actual starter that everybody was kind of looking towards, that's when a lot of the Shy's actual issues ended up taking over, and his lack of, commitment to the regular season ended up becoming a real issue for IG before. Now, he's taken some time off, and maybe that means that he's going to come back, more revitalized. Maybe he feels inspired by the fact that he's coming back on IG with Rookie to try and, do something, be the best team in the LPL. But one of the reasons that the Shy's grade is going to be so low is, again, because I want to reiterate that this is a domestic ranking. And I'll be honest, the Shy has maybe never been good in the regular season in LPL history. Like, I can't remember a regular season where he actually played well for the entire regular season. He is a playoff performer. He is a Worlds performer. He has not been particularly good in the regular season in the LPL ever as a player, and it's just because he's not particularly committed to random regular season games. Now, we'll see if that changes with the format changing, a lot of best of 5s, best of 3s coming in, and so, we'll see if he feels a little bit more, I guess, enticed by some of these regular season matchups, but just having them back from a brand perspective is a huge upgrade, and regardless of whether or not you think the Shy is like the pinnacle of consistency, which he definitely is not, he's an upgrade over You Should Know Me, who was, a really high variance top laner that had some good moments, and I think was starting to develop something, but, the Shy is just better in every single way, and Rookie is, the dream to bring back here. Invictus has probably been trying to get him for years to come back to IG, and they were able to land him this offseason. There are some other players that are obviously worth talking about the rest of this team. Jeje coming into the jungle. This is the other player that I'm kind of on a wait-and-see approach with, kind of similar to the Shy, mostly because he was just awful last year, and a lot of people are going to point out that it's Edward Gaming. He was on a team that really was bad, all things considered. They just didn't have a lot of good things going for them at all. And yeah, that's true, right? Like, the surrounding core was bad, the team was bad, and sometimes it can be hard to look even okay as a jungler when the rest of your team is just losing every single laning phase. I understand that, but Jeje was also bad. Like, I don't want it to seem like I'm trying to give him a cop-out. He checked out mentally, like, very early on into the season. Even when Ale was still playing well for that team in the spring split, Jeje was just completely mentally checked. And quite frankly, the moment they benched him, the moment EDG, went in a different direction, that team got infinitely better. And so, we'll see. I feel like Jeje's going to be fine. I feel like it was just a concentration thing. He was on a horrible team, probably didn't have any motivation, and he reportedly was very injured in his elbow for a lot of last year. If those issues pop back up again, I could see this being, something that actually does cause some issues for this team, because I think topside is so volatile. But Jeje should be fine. I'm just going to grade him a little bit inconsistently for now, because his grading scale last year was just so horrendous. Like, he genuinely graded out as one of the worst junglers in the entire LPL. I think he'll be fine. Again, I'm kind of trusting that it's more of a mental thing than it is a physical thing or a gameplay thing from him, and that's why he gets the upgrade tag and the B grade here. But inconsistent, I think, is definitely fair to say about the top side of this map. But you know what? Honestly, the part that I'm most excited about when it comes to this team is the bot lane. Gala and Mako as a bot lane duo sounds incredible, and it sounds like something that could genuinely take over the entire league. They're the highest graded players on this team. Mako is my #1 graded support in the world. In my opinion, he is the best support in the world at the current moment. I think last year's tape very much doubled down on that. The only year he's not been in that conversation for me was, of course, 2023, which had a lot of problems. It felt like him and Uzi never really got on when it came to playing together on Edward Gaming. There were just a lot of issues with that roster in general, but Mako, outside of that, has just been the best support in the world for 5 years, or like in the conversation for being it. I think he was hyper consistent last year. He's a jack of all trades, master of all. He can play engagers, he can play enchanters, he can play early game, he can play for lane, he can play for team fights, he can play for mid-game skirmishes. He can just do everything. He's just so good at every part of the game. He's obviously a huge macro and vocal threat. Like, there's just no negatives to his game, and he's going to get an A grade because of it. Any team would love to have Mako, and apparently there was a gigantic sweepstakes for him this offseason, and he chose this super team. Gala coming in is like also the pinnacle of consistency. He gets an A- because his upside isn't quite as high as someone like Elk or Jackie Love, or even some of the other players like Viper over in the LCK. But the player I've always compared him to is Gumayushi. I think he is super stable as both a strong side and a weak side player, can really step up if his team is underperforming and be a primary carry if he needs to, but is most comfortable being that secondary carry that plays weak side and being like the best player in the world in that role. Like, I don't want it to seem like weak side, oh, I don't think he can primary carry. He absolutely can. He's just so good and so valuable as somebody who can play on weak side, because there aren't a lot of AD carries that can do that. And especially if you're going to want to play more for rookie or for the shy, Gala being on this team is actually, in my opinion, a perfect stylistic fit for that style of moving pieces around the map and allowing him to just kind of function in the bot lane as somebody that steps up in the mid to late game. This is an awesome team, and obviously, IG is over the moon that they were able to bring this together. I think that there were a lot of things that kind of had to go right for them this offseason, but the moment they locked in the Shy and Rookie, it really felt like everything else kind of fell into place, that a lot of people wanted to play with them on this historic org with these historic players that represent the org. And, I'm just happy for IG fans. I know it's been a rough couple of years trying to, trudge through a lot of the negatives. I mean, look at the team on the top side of this map. It's just not very good. On is a great player, and he single-handedly carried games for them last year, but you're not losing anything by going to this roster. You just took a team that was middling towards the bottom of the LPL standings and made them a contender overnight. But then moving on to the back quarter of this video, and it's a team that I think improved a lot this offseason that probably won't get talked about nearly enough. It's Edward Gaming. I think they had a pretty good offseason. I think you're looking at a team that is pretty competitive, at least all things considered, in the LPL, where, as you've seen with a lot of the teams we've talked about, the middle of the LPL kind of sucks. Like, there really isn't a lot of depth to the league right now. It feels like a top 6 and then everyone else, even really like a top 5, and then like a couple of teams kind of fighting it out for a top 6. Like, it's not the deepest league in the world, and in that environment, I think a team like EDG in their current iteration could actually be pretty dangerous and pretty scary. So I'm excited to go over it. Let's talk about their offseason. Their lineup is looking like ZDZ in the top lane, Xiaohao in the jungle, Angel in the mid lane, Assume at AD carry, and Wink at support. Wink, obviously the only member returning here. He's awesome. He is super underrated as a player. He has completely developed as a support. There was a time period in like 2022 where I was calling him one of the worst players in the LPL because he was like, his support tape was just horrible. The like first couple of splits that he role swapped over, it took him so long to figure something out, and then him and On just clicked. Like one split in Invictus Gaming, it just like he figured it out. And at least so far, he's really been able to keep up that pace. I think he was pretty good when he came over to EDG. That whole situation was a bit of a disaster in the middle of the split, but generally speaking, I'm still very high on Wink. I think he can be like a B or a B plus like style support, somewhere in that range of like, 4th to 7th best support in the LPL. Like, that's a realistic range, I would say, for Wink. He's probably closer to the bottom of that, but he could be a top 5 support in the LPL really on any given day if things were to go right. And I think pairing him up with someone like Assume, who we're kind of, seeing if he he can break out, is a really good, way to do things, a really good process. He's going to be coming in as kind of the replacement upside pick to Leave. Leave was the AD carry for them for basically all of last year, and they were really waiting for him to try to, re-grasp that 2023 spring form, and it just didn't really happen for this team. Assume, I think, is another really good punt. I've talked about him in the same vein as 1xN and, a lot of the players in that zone. A lot of Astari is kind of, similar to that as well. I've kind of talked about him in that same quadrant, and I think it's entirely fair to compare him to those players, especially 1xN. I think they're very similar in terms of their upside. Neither of them are the most mechanically gifted in the entire universe, but both of them are very stable players that I think are very good for teams to have. I think a lot of people are looking for reasons to kind of blow their success out of proportion. I don't think they're going to be stars at this level. I don't think Assume is ever going to be a star at this level. I've, kind of talked him down in the past in terms of what the expectation, especially on Reddit, from a lot of people were, but he's a good starter. Like, he is somebody that you're happy to have on the team, and he's never really been given the opportunity to actually play for, like, a good team. He's basically gone from bad team to bad team, or at least mediocre team to mediocre team. This is probably the best roster he's ever had around him. Maybe this is the year that he breaks out. I think him and Wink could be a very fun duo, and I'm listing this as a change because both of these are just kind of upside 80 carries, but Assume's floor is so much higher than Leaves is, even if I think his mechanical upside is a little bit lower. But the big upgrade here for me, or like the clear-cut upgrade for me, is going from Cryan to Angel. Cryan's fine. He's like the definition of a B- player. He's, someone you would be okay with starting like in a middle tier team. You can make playoffs with someone like Cryan, but you don't feel particularly great about it. And certainly if you're trying to be better than like a top 8 or 9 team, you probably want to move on and get someone better. And Angel is someone better. Angel's a really good mid laner. He has been for a long time. I was actually really low on Angel for a long time on this channel, but I've come around to him. I think that Ninjas in Pyjamas year, or that half a year, I guess, one split, half a year that he was on Ninjas in Pyjamas in summer in 2023 really opened my eyes to what Angel could be like at his best. I think he was okay for OMG last year. There were times where he was solo winning games for them, even on OMG, but I think it was a worse 2024 than like the back half of 2023. He's still a valuable player, though I think bringing him in adds some stability and some veteran experience to this team. And then you're bringing in the duo on the top side of the map. I call them a duo because it seems like they're just going to follow each other around everywhere. They go from AL to Weibo and now here to Edward Gaming. It's ZDZ and Xiao Hao. I think this is much better for ZDZ. I think he's going to be pretty happy to be on a team like this. I don't feel particularly great about ZDZ. He's like the definition of like whatever. Like, you can play him in the top lane, and if he's the worst player on your team, you can survive with that, which in my opinion he is on this roster, but you're not going to feel phenomenal. Like, he's not somebody that I would ever, want on a top 5 team. Like, he should be nowhere near that. Xiao Hao, however, is a very, very talented jungler. Didn't quite have the 2024 he was looking for. He's always been a bit of a summer warrior and got kicked off of Weibo Gaming before he could even, get that summer ramp up. But this is somebody who, in both 2023 and 2022, was an all-pro in the summer split for me. I think this is a guy who could, best case scenario, be like a world's defining jungler. Like, I think he's got the talent to be able to do that. He's a little bit limited in terms of his playstyle. He's very much a carry-oriented player, but I think pairing that up with someone like Angel is actually a really good idea, and I think that's one of the big reasons why I'm so excited about this team. I think Wink is super stable as a support, and Xiao Hao Angel as a mid-jungle duo could actually be very scary and very difficult to deal with for a lot of teams that just don't have the mechanical skill to be able to keep up with them, which is why I said that this team could very much be like the best of the rest. Like, if you're looking at a team to try to get 6th or 7th or 8th, or, kind of be the FunPlus Phoenix of this year, I think Edward Gaming's actually in a really good spot to be that team. They could make the regional qualifiers, and I wouldn't be entirely stunned. Now, I do think some development needs to happen to get there. Assume needs to step up. I think he's really the one you're looking at, but this is a pretty high floor team that I think had a pretty decent offseason, if not like a little bit of an average placement overall. But then moving on now to our number 14th team, and, it's a pretty interesting offseason, one that I did not think was going to go well at the start, but turned out pretty well. It's Ultra Prime. They were kind of last, I would say, of all the teams to really figure out what they wanted to do. RNG was obviously pretty slow as well, and we'll get to them. But Ultra Prime I didn't really have expectations for, and I actually think they came away with at least somewhat of an interesting offseason, mostly because of their imports here. I really do think that they've made some interesting decisions to bring in some Frank Esports players that could theoretically actually make this team better. I think you took the best parts of that team that actually was really good in the PCS last year and could potentially turn that into something that has legs moving forward. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Jiang in the top lane, Junhao in the jungle, Saber in the mid lane, Wacko at AD carry, carry, and Rosie Love at support. There are no members from the starting, like, main roster of Ultra Prime returning for 2025. This is all going to be new players. Now, a lot of these players, or two of these players, are internal promotions from their Ultra Prime LDL team. Saber and Rosie Love are going to be coming up, and I guess we can talk about them first. They're some of the players I have the least amount of information on when it comes to the entirety of the league and the promotions, mostly because it's kind of difficult to find games, actual VODs of the Ultra Prime LDL team. Saber was a really quick lock for this team. They clearly have a lot of faith in him because he was one of the first players that was actually confirmed into the LPL moving into the offseason, and that includes like a bunch of veterans. Like, this team clearly made the decision to start Saber moving into 2025. We'll see if that ends up working out. Rosie Love, I think, could theoretically be fine. I've watched one game of both of these players. Again, I really don't want to make any like major assertions. I'm letting you know right now that I don't have the info now. I will have the info when we make the power rankings list later. For now, they're going to get kind of the default C+, and they're going to get change grades. I personally would have brought back Nickett, but it does seem like he is signed with a different team, maybe not as a starter, but at the very least is not in the organization any longer, whatever the case may be. Rosie Love is the player I probably have the least amount of knowledge on in the entire video. Saber, I did get a little bit more time to actually prep for, and he seems okay. Again, I'm going to trust that this org really feels good about him because they are giving him that internal promotion, and they did it so fast, but definitely reserving judgment on those two players. I think Junhao, though, is a player that I am more willing to talk about. This is a good addition. I would say it's listed as a change because Hacker was actually pretty good last year, was very much a positive for Ultra Prime for the most part, was the best player on this team and was the one that was kind of giving them a lot of victories. But Junhao's a really interesting prospect. He's somebody that I actually analyzed a lot last year going into the start of 2024 because a lot of his teammates were actually picked up and, moved around. Jue is obviously the obvious one, but there were multiple players on that team that I kind of thought were LPL caliber when I was watching the 2023 tape of BLG Jr. He got an extra year down in the LDL. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. I've checked out some of the tape. It doesn't really feel all that different. I think he is a pretty solid jungle prospect, maybe not on the same level as someone like Climber for LGD. I think that that's really like a game breaker, but Junhao should be somebody that can step in and perform okay. The only concern is, again, this is a very young and very inexperienced roster, all things considered, outside of Wacko. I think that that's never really good for a rookie jungler. You want to be put into a situation where you don't have to do all of the heavy lifting yourself. We'll see if that's a problem for Junhao. I don't think this roster is super talented, kind of surrounding him, and, that's never good. So for now, I like the individual player. Maybe don't like the fit for him in particular, but the big imports here coming over from the PCS, coming over from Frank Esports, Jiang and Wacko. Wacko is definitely the more established one. He's been to Worlds before. You kind of know what you're getting out of him individually as a player. He's really solid. Like, I wouldn't say that he's a star, but I would expect him to come in and be fine for this team, be somebody that can really function well as like a middle tier AD carry. This is going to be an upgrade to Doggo, who I believe is going back to the APAC region, but you could definitely do a lot worse than Wacko, who I think is somebody that, is fine to be a primary carry, is probably not ideal in this circumstance to be a primary carry, but he's getting a B- grade for a reason. He is good enough to start in the LPL. That has become clear over the course of his career, and I think if it opens up the door for you to make your star top laner feel a little bit more comfortable, then that's definitely the goal, because Jiang really is the, big grab here for me. This guy's awesome. I was watching a lot of PCS tape from last year going into Worlds to try to get an idea, obviously, of the Worlds teams, as I do, going into Worlds every year, and this guy was, the most impressive player in the entire region when I was watching playoff tape from APAC. It was actually genuinely absurd how good his tape was and how good his mechanics are. It reminds me a lot of what people were talking about with You Should Know Me when he came over from, the APAC region back in the day, but I think Jiang is much better. I think he is somebody that could come in and really be a game breaker at this level. It reminds me of when, Fofo and, a lot of those players were coming over in that second wave of PCS players, LMS players, I guess, at the time, coming over to the LPL. I think Jiang is as good of a prospect as a lot of those players were. I think Ultra Prime's not exactly the best landing spot. This org doesn't exactly have a great reputation of performing well in the LPL, but I really like this punt, and if Wacko is kind of the stabilizing presence that can help you, meld with the rest of the team, if Jiang, needs to come in and have a player like that to help him, I think Wacko is certainly good enough to do that, but Jiang could be an actual star at this level. I don't want to give him higher than a B-, because again, the fit scares me, and also he's never played, above the PCS, and even then he was super inconsistent over in APAC, but I think he's incredibly talented, and he certainly is the gem of this Ultra Prime offseason. Junhao, I think, is a player that can do really well in certain circumstances, but Saber and Rosylove have a lot more to prove to me because of these internal promotions and because Ultra Prime's LDL team wasn't particularly good. You know, that being, it was hard to find tape for a reason. They weren't in the finals. They didn't make a deep playoff run or anything like that, and so it's definitely going to be an interesting year. I would lead towards the side that Ultra Prime is likely still probably going to struggle, but I really like the big punt on a player that maybe not a lot of other LPL teams were looking at. But now it's time to move on to our penultimate team in this video, and let me tell you guys, I have been itching, I mean truly itching, to talk about this team's offseason because I just can't properly explain how it makes me feel. It's Team WE, and they're up on the screen, and I don't know if anybody saw this coming. I don't know if anybody expected me to be so excited to talk about Team WE's offseason, but let me tell you, I don't think I've ever been more excited to talk about the direction and the decisions that a team is making than WE is going into 2025, because I truly think that they, first of all, watch my videos. There's no way that they don't watch my videos, because I'll get to it in a second, but they, A, watch my videos, and B, have very much determined that the best course of action is to take the players I like the least in every single role and make a team out of it. And I physically cannot comprehend how this has happened, how you get a lineup that looks like this, and I'm sure some people are higher on this lineup than I am, but it's literally every player that I have criticized on the channel over the past year, all conglomerated into one team. Like, it feels impossible that this exists, and it feels very targeted at me. We'll get into how I actually feel about the team, but this has got to be the funniest roster ever constructed. It is the buy low team. It's literally going down the list of players I've heavily criticized and saying, you know, get them together, bring them in, we're going to figure it out. So let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Cube in the top lane, Tianjin in the jungle, Karis in the mid lane, Taiyun at AD carry, and Vampire at support. You might notice some fun grades. Nobody on this team above a C+, and Tianjin's very lucky to have that C+, because he was pretty good overall in summer. I'm not going to try and deny that. I said as much on the channel, but Tianjin was like the poster child for players I thought were mega overhyped and mega overrated going into the summer split. Before he actually started playing well for OMG, when he was on those Invictus Gaming teams, I was roasting him. Like, I was going in every single week talking about how absurd it was that he was getting as many opportunities as he was getting, and for the most part, on that team, I was right. He was a Rengar one-trick that couldn't even play Rengar at a high level and was getting absolutely obliterated in the early game. He did have his early games fixed, I would say, overall in OMG, which is why he gets the highest grade, and he is the only player to not be considered a downgrade from the previous year in terms of the grades. But if Tianjin's like your bar, if he's the player that you're going into the season being like easily the best player on the roster and the most, the one I feel the best about, that's a problem, because I was destroying this guy in Spring Split last year on this channel. The other player that I think you could even make kind of a pass for is probably Cube on the top side. It's been like 3 years since Cube has played even remotely average League of Legends. He has been miserably bad in his last couple of stops. When he first left WE, that really started to, you know, kind of enable the slide, I would say. But his time on OMG was just as bad. It's not like he got better after leaving. Like, he was really bad, one of the worst top laners in the league on WE last time he played here, and then he got worse. And yeah, I guess you're pairing him up with Tianjin, but remember, Cube got replaced before Tianjin got on OMG last year. These are not former teammates. These are players that didn't even cross paths in the night. Cube was already out of that OMG team by the time Tianjin was brought in, and so he's going to get a C grade, and honestly, that's pretty generous considering the gameplay that he has shown over the past couple of years. He's not been a good player. He was known at his peak for Rare Atom as this like supreme weak side top laner that was so good without resources. He just gets demolished in the 1v1 nowadays, and it's not like he's been consistently getting to team fights either. It's just not been good. And these are the players that I feel the best about. Let's get into the mid lane. Karis. Again, if you don't know, I cover the LCK, so I have a pretty good idea of Karis and Taiyun. We'll get into that. Karis has been given opportunity after opportunity after opportunity in the LCK, and all he has done is be a bottom 1, bottom 2 mid laner in the region. And I say like not bottom 1 because the LCK has truly had some horrible mid lane performances over the past couple of years, whether they be from like DRX mid laners or Nongshim mid laners. Like, there has always been somebody that's been slightly worse than Karis, but Karis by definition is like the worst mid laner in the LCK, and you're like, yeah, snatch him up, bring him over. This guy has shown absolutely nothing and been given 3 years worth of game time to develop. 2 years on Bro and 1 year on Hanwha Life. None of it has looked good. Like, this guy has proven that he is not a top level player. player, and you're like, yeah, that's an import slot. Sign me up. It's not even like the Satab example where at least he was good in the LDL, or the LCK Challengers League. Like, Karis was good in the LCK Challengers League 4 years ago and hasn't looked good since then. I just don't really understand bringing him over, and if I don't understand Karis, boy, can I not even begin to explain the thought process behind bringing over Taiyun, who, as I'm sure you guys know, if you've not only watched the channel, but watched the LCK at all, or watched any coverage on the LCK at all, is my worst graded top-level player ever. Like, there has never been a player that has been more overmatched at his level than Taiyun at the LCK level. Never in the history of my grading scale have I ever given a player a lower grade than what I gave Taiyun in 2023 on the Kwangdong Freaks. And he had the starting spot going into 2024. He was so bad in the first week that they had to look for an emergency replacement from their longtime backup in Bull down in the Challengers League, and he immediately made the team better. That's how bad Taiyun has been over in the LCK. To say, yeah, that's the guy, we don't just want to bring him in to be our starter. We're going to import him. We're going to use an import slot to bring in Taiyun. He gets a C- grade from me. If you want to give him a D, like a D+, like, yeah, dude, like, what is happening? What is the thought process behind importing Karis and Taiyun? I just can't possibly understand it. There is no line that you could draw this through, genuinely. The only thing I can think of when it comes to these two getting imported is that they were by far the cheapest options. Like, that is the only reasonable explanation in my eyes for this existing at all in the first place. And it doesn't even end there. They brought in Vampire to play support with him. And I know there's some Vampire truthers on Reddit, and I've seen Discord messages, and there are servers I'm in where people are like, you know, Vampire actually reminds me a lot of, you know, X-player that was really bad at the start of their career and ended up breaking out. First of all, Vampire has like no actual pro experience. He was thrown into the deep end on Edward Gaming last year and was asked to sink or swim, and he sunk to the bottom of the ocean. He went over to Invictus Gaming after that swap and was slightly better, but like very, very slightly. Like, his bad games were just as bad. He just had a couple of games that felt like, okay, I can start to see the vision here with Vampire, but he is nowhere near ready to play in the LPL consistently, like over a large course of time. And yet you have people out there that are like, oh, he reminds me so much of On when he was on Weibo Gaming. What? Like, huh? Are we watching the same games? I just can't reasonably believe that a human being would come to that conclusion. First of all, I was on the On train long before anybody else. You can check the VODs on this channel. You can check the track record I have. I was a huge fan of On before he, like, really broke out a couple of years ago, and, you know, especially for Bilibili. I thought he was great in that final year on Weibo Gaming, which is why I was so high on BLG going into that 2023, but... like, are you kidding me? Like, comparing Vampire's mechanical ceiling to On's? Like, what are we doing? Have we lost the plot? Is there any sort of, like, reasonable take left in the universe? Like, it's just an insane thing to say. If you think Vampire could be a capable LPL support, okay, sure, I could get behind that. Like, there were flashes where he showed some really good parts. If you think Vampire could be a top 3 to 4 support, not only in the LPL, but, like, in the world, you're smoking crack. Like, there's just, like, I don't know what to tell you. And maybe it eventually comes along, but there is literally nothing on tape to determine that that could even be a possibility. And now you're pairing him up with what I consider to be the worst player I've ever evaluated down in the bot lane. Yeah, I think the bot lane's gonna struggle a bit. I think Vampire's development might not look so good. Karis is coming into the mid lane. He can't win a 1v1. Like, this dude cannot stay even in lane. And now you're sitting here with a losing bot lane, a losing mid lane. Cube is weak side top, but also getting destroyed 1v1. And Tianjin, who, yes, wants to carry and probably will receive every bit of resource that this team has, like, it's not like he's gonna salvage this team. His macro is horrible. Like, that's the biggest weakness of his game. He's got good hands and he's got no brain. What are we doing? Like, this is maybe the worst offseason ever? Like, I say that. Like, I say, oh, is this the worst offseason ever? But they're my favorite team in the world. Like, I want to make that abundantly clear. I'm going to be so biased towards WE throughout this entire year because there is nothing more I want than for this team full of players that I think it was specifically designed to torture me to somehow be like top 8. Like, that would be the dream. Like, there's no way it happens, right? Like, this is the worst team in the LPL, but if it does, I'm going to be so over the moon giddy. Like, I'm sorry, I'm just letting you guys know now, I'm going to be biased towards WE because this is the funniest thing I've ever seen. But that's going to bring us to our final team of the video, and it's one of the most historic organizations here in the LPL that very much did not find success last year. It's Royal Never Give Up. RNG, and their offseason is hit or miss. I think that there were a couple inevitabilities for them in a good way, where, Milky Way coming back from loan, or at least reportedly, being on loan to FPX and, being able to get him back for the 2025 season is really huge. And generally speaking, I think they did an okay job kind of bringing in some good young talent that I think could be interesting in the future, but some of their lingering problems very much are still persisting, and I'm very concerned that this team just doesn't have the upside that they're looking for because they're sticking to a core that I'm just not sure is good enough to be able to push forward with. So let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Xiaoshu in the top lane, Milky Way in the jungle, Tongyuan in the mid lane, Jiachi in the AD carry role. Please let me know if that's like a horrible pronunciation. You guys usually do much better at that than I do. And then Lele in the support position. A couple of these players are going to be pretty familiar to RNG fans. First of all, obviously Tongyuan coming back. We're going to talk about him because I'm over it. Like, I'm over Tongyuan. I don't think he is a good League of Legends player. I don't know what the situation is. I've heard some rumors in the past that he's got some family members in like the upper management of RNG. And if that's the case, then that's why he has the job, because he genuinely has not been good enough to justify this really ever. I mean, outside of maybe 2023 summer where he was inconsistently okay, like he had finally started to show flashes for that team when given the full-time role, but last year was horrific. Like, he was one of the worst players in the LPL last year. He continues to be the starting mid laner for one of the bigger organizations in all of League of Legends, and I just don't really get it. Like, I don't think he's good enough to be starting here, and he really holds back this team's grade in terms of not only the offseason, but like what I'm projecting them to do in 2025. I don't know if you can make top 10 with your mid laner being Tongyuan. That role is just too important, and Tongyuan is just not good enough. He's like the worst mid laner in the entire league by a pretty large margin. So I don't like keeping him. I don't like bringing him back. I just don't think it's the right decision. I certainly don't think if you were going to bring anyone back, it should have been him in the mid lane. As you can see, the whole top side of the map last year got a C grade from me. Geju came very close to getting a C- because I just hated his tape, but Tongyuan's just not very good, man. Like, I don't really know what else to say. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he figures it out. I was wrong about Haichao. I gave Haichao a C grade at the start of last year, and so, who knows? Maybe he figures it out and it comes along, but right now I just have seen basically nothing to convince me that that is going to happen, and he is the only returning player. Now, there are some RNG kind of holdovers that are coming back. Milky Way, obviously the big one, on loan with FPX last year, was the rookie of the year, the single best rookie in the entire league, and I think he is the one who saves this grade from being like truly atrocious for RNG. Tongyuan coming back really kind of put a damper on this offseason for me, but Milky Way being here for RNG is just such a positive overall. They've been waiting and looking for this kind of like carry star to be able to kind of move them forward into their next, era, their next generation, if you will. He is that guy. He is a carry-oriented jungler who can absolutely tear apart any game that he gets a lead in. Now, I do want to say he was exposed in the playoffs, and that's just kind of the truth of the situation. I know a lot of people are going to continue to kind of defend those playoff performances, but his playstyle is very exploitable, and it was exploited in the playoffs by other teams. That is to say that if he wins early, he can win any game. If you take him out of the game, if you put every resource into stopping Milky Way early, he is horrible at playing from behind, and also teams generally, or at least last year, his team just didn't know how to play without him. And so let's see if that becomes a recurring issue now on a different org with a different group of players. If that continues to be a problem for Milky Way, I'm going to start worrying. I'm going to start panicking. For now, it honestly holds him back. He's a B graded player for me. There's no way I would have given him a B after the regular season. He would have been a B plus at the bare minimum in terms of the performances that he was giving. He would have been like a top 5 jungler in terms of my rankings. But the playoffs very much concern me because it kind of was starting to show itself at the end of the regular season as well, where teams just feel like they've started to figure out his playstyle. And if that's the case, if he starts to trail off a bit in the same way that Bo did once he started getting figured out, that's a problem. I think they're very similar players, and so, we'll see what ends up happening. He's got a lot of responsibility on this team, but the other kind of familiar player to RNG fans here is going to be Lele in the support position. I know I'm jumping around, but it makes sense in my brain. Lele has really jumped between two organizations. He was a FunPlus player, and then eventually it didn't work out there, so he went over to RNG, and he was the starting support for a bit here for RNG before they picked up Ming, and, really wanted to go in that direction. Ming was horrific, and B- is incredibly generous towards his grade, but he's Ming. I can't really give him any lower than that. So, Lele was out. He went back to FunPlus, played with FPX Blaze, and was generally fine on that team. I watched tape mostly for Sorrow when I was doing the FPX Blaze analysis, but Lele, very luckily for me, was announced as the starting support for RNG today as I'm filming this video, and, as Demacia Cup starts, and so, I'd already seen a lot of his tape, and obviously I'd known him from some LPL tenures, and he's fine. I'm okay with him starting, but he's certainly not going to break the bank. He's somebody who's really struggled at this level in the past, and, he has upside. His tape looks okay from the LDL perspective, but I'm not expecting him to break through. Giachi, again, if I'm saying that, entirely wrong, please let me know. I'm sure I am, but I can't really fix it until you guys let me know down in the comments. He's only going to be listed as a downgrade here because I really like Huanfeng, and he really was doing a ton of 1v9ing for this team. Last split, he was the only player even remotely trying. I compared him to On in terms of the performances he was putting out, and I still think Huanfeng should absolutely have an LPL job. I think it's ridiculous that no team is willing to take a risk on him, but I think Giachi's an interesting alternative option here. He's been in the top esports system his entire career, basically. He did not play in the summer split for that top esports challengers team because he was the substitute for top esports, for that entire year. I recognize his tape from going over a lot of the top esports challengers, tape in 2023 or at the end of 2023, and, going into 2024, looking at Neu and looking at Nickit, and he was on that team as well as the AD carry, and his tape was pretty good. I was pretty into Nickit and what his LDL tape looked like, and a lot of that was how good their synergy was in the bot lane. There is rumors that they have signed Nickit as well. That hasn't been announced by anybody, and Lele is playing in Demacia Cup, and everybody else, all the other starters are playing in Demacia Cup for RNG. I have no reason to believe that Nickit will be the starting support, but Nickit would be better, in my opinion here, just mostly because of the synergy, but at least for now, I have to consider this a downgrade because it's been a while since I've actually seen tape from him, and, generally speaking, the tape I saw, I was more focused on jungle than I was on bot lane, but Xiaoshu is the other addition here that I really like. I think he's a good upside swing. He's what everyone wants Harry to be over on OMG. He is genuinely a player with real flaws that is really inconsistent, but major upside and a crazy mechanical ceiling. He wins lane a lot more than he loses lane, and he just needs to be able to reel himself in a lot of these more dangerous circumstances. Again, I think he can be a really good top laner at this level, and pairing him up with Milky Way is kind of what saves this grade for me. I also think bot lane could be fine, especially if Nickit ends up coming in and being the starter for this team. That's where I think things get a lot more interesting. I like the AD carry. I like Giachi coming in and being there in the AD carry role, and the top side's good, but Tong Yuan just inherently holds this team back in terms of what I can project for them and how good I can claim their offseason is, because you can do better in the mid lane. There are so many other options that were available. Even someone like a Cryan is still available, and he just gives you so much of a higher floor, even if the ceiling isn't necessarily there. I just don't really like Tong Yuan, and I think it really holds back my excitement for this roster. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL 2025 offseason overview, review, and grades video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what your favorite or least favorite offseason was down in the comment section below. Where am I way too high? Where am I way too low? I'm sure I've already gotten a bunch of hate comments, and so let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. Quickly, I'm going to go over my favorite and then least favorite offseasons. How can I give favorite offseason to anyone other than WE? I mean, truly, at the end of the day, it's the funniest possible outcome, but seriously, it's got to go to Invictus Gaming. I mean, there's really no other option. They completely went from an irrelevant team, quite frankly, to a team that is probably going to compete to go to the World Championships. That is huge, but JD Gaming, obviously a very nice, secondary option there for best offseason. And when you're looking at worst, I mean, WE is best and worst, right? It's insane that they went with the direction that they went in. They got the worst of any team over the course of this offseason, but, they're very funny, so I have to kind of exclude them. I think outside of that, honestly, Thunder Talk is definitely one of the teams that comes to mind here, because no changes is just disappointing from a team that isn't good enough to really break that, top upper echelon. And also, you just got worse losing your star player in the mid lane and didn't really replace him with any sort of impact player anywhere else. It just feels like a wasted offseason for an organization like that. But let me know what you agree with or disagree with there. Let me know what your favorite or least favorite offseasons were down in the comments. And of course, check out the other videos. The LTA version of this is going to be up, and then it's the holiday vacation. We will be back with the power rankings at the beginning of the winter split. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all